Hello everyone and welcome back to the Unexplained Diaries. Here on this channel I share real-life encounters with beings from beyond the skies to help you unwind and drift off to sleep. Before we dive in, I would love to hear from you. Leave a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from. Now, find a comfortable spot, relax, and let's begin. I was staying at my cousin Adrian's cabin for a long weekend when it happened. His place sat at the edge of a big clearing in northern Vermont. Nothing around it but pine forest, a gravel driveway, and a sky that always felt bigger than it should. I'd gone up there to clear my head after a stressful month at work, and the first 2 nights were quiet in the way only rural places can be. On the third morning, just before dawn, something woke me. Not a noise, more like a change in the room's light. I opened my eyes expecting to see the faint blue of early morning, but the window glowed in this strange, narrow way, like someone was shining a flashlight straight up from the horizon. I sat up slowly, trying to figure out what I was looking at. The sky beyond the trees was brightening, but only in a single vertical strip. It couldn't have been more than a few inches wide from my perspective. The rest of the horizon stayed dark. No color gradients, no soft glow, no gradual spread across the treetops, just a vertical band of pale white light. I checked the clock on my phone, 5:18 a.m. Sunrise wasn't supposed to happen for another 40 minutes, but the way that strip of light stood there, rigid and thin, it didn't look like the beginning of sunrise anyway. I quietly stepped out of bed so I wouldn't wake Adrian in the other room and moved closer to the window. The cabin was dead silent. Even the usual creaking of the old wood felt muted somehow. As my eyes adjusted, I noticed something else. The trees in front of that vertical glow looked wrong, like their silhouettes were being stretched or sharpened unnaturally. Not actually moving, just distorted by the brightness behind them. I unlocked the back door and stepped onto the porch. The air hit me immediately, cold, unmoving, dense. It carried none of the scents I'd smelled the mornings before. No damp pine, no earth, nothing. Just a sterile emptiness. The vertical strip of light brightened slightly. Not dramatically, just enough that the edge of the clearing lit up in a thin line. It didn't behave like sunlight. Sunrise spreads. It softens the horizon. It doesn't choose one place and concentrate there. I stood at the porch railing, gripping it without realizing how tight my hands were. For a few seconds, the strip held steady. Then, very gradually, it began to shrink. Not fade. Retract. The bottom edge lifted upward with absolute smoothness, like the light was being pulled towards something above the trees. The column shortened in a perfectly straight line, leaving darkness beneath it like nothing had been there at all. My throat tightened. I backed up until my shoulders met the cabin wall. When the strip rose halfway up the tree line, I noticed a brief movement. No, not movement, more like a disturbance, just above the point where the glow ended. A faint ripple in the air. It reminded me of heat haze, except the temperature was below freezing. The strip kept retracting until it was just a small glowing dash high in the sky. It hung there unnervingly still. Then it blinked out. Everything below it was instantly dim. The clearing returned to its normal pre-dawn darkness, except it didn't feel normal. Not yet. I stayed outside for another minute or two, waiting to see if anything else would happen. That was when the birds began singing all at once. A full burst of morning bird song, a sound that should have been gradual, hit the clearing suddenly, like a switch had been flipped. The contrast from the heavy silence moments earlier was so sharp it made the hair on my arms stand up. I went back inside and shut the door gently, not wanting it to echo. My pulse was still fast. I moved to the kitchen and poured a glass of water, but it tasted metallic, like the pipes had somehow gone stale overnight. That had never happened before, not even the day I arrived. When Adrian finally woke around 7, the sun had risen normally, spreading warm light across the clearing like it always did. I didn't mention the vertical glow at first. I told myself it must have been some atmospheric thing. Light refraction, weird optical illusion, something explainable. But while we were drinking coffee, I noticed something strange near the tree line. A long strip of frost was missing. Just a narrow path, maybe 2 feet wide and 20 feet long, where the grass was completely thawed even though everything around it glittered with ice. It followed the exact line that the vertical glow had illuminated earlier. I walked over to it while Adrian watched from the porch. The grass was damp and flattened, like something warm had hovered above it. No footprints, no tire marks, no sign of animals. When I crouched down, the air felt slightly warmer in that strip. Not warm enough to see steam, but enough to feel it in my lungs. I told Adrian what I'd seen before dawn. He didn't laugh. He didn't joke. He just stared past me toward the horizon with this serious, quiet look I'd never seen on him before. Then he said something I keep replaying in my head. "I heard something at 5," he said. "A hum or I don't know. I thought it was the heater kicking on, but it wasn't." The cabin heater was electric and it didn't hum. We checked the security camera on the porch out of curiosity, but the footage between 5:15 and 5:20 was corrupted, not missing, just warped. The sky looked smeared. The trees flickered in and out. My silhouette on the porch was visible for one frame, then vanished the next. Adrian tried replaying it 3 times before giving up. Later that day, when the sun was high, the thawed strip refroze like nothing had happened. By nightfall, I found myself checking the horizon every few minutes, expecting another vertical glow to appear. It didn't. But that didn't make the feeling of it any easier to shake. The way the light rose like something being withdrawn, not emitted. Like whatever made it had changed its mind. I was heading home from a late shift when it happened. It was just after 2 a.m. and the streets in my neighborhood were completely empty, typical for a weeknight. I usually parked on the street a few houses down because my driveway was too narrow to back into when I was tired, and I remember thinking how unusually quiet everything felt that night. Even the air felt still, like the whole block was paused. I had just reached my walkway when I noticed the glow. Not bright, not dramatic, just a faint, bluish-white haze above the roofline of my house. So faint, I almost thought I imagined it. It didn't spread outward like moonlight or bounce off the clouds. It was concentrated directly above my place, hovering maybe 20 or 30 feet up. I stopped in the middle of the sidewalk. From that angle, half the glow was hidden behind the roof, but I could see enough of it to know it wasn't normal. It had a shape to it. Not round, not sharp, but softly defined, like a smudge of light in the sky. It didn't flicker. It didn't move. It just stayed there, quietly glowing in a way that felt intentional. I checked the house next door. Their roof was completely dark. Whatever this was, it was only above mine. I forced myself to walk forward slowly. My footsteps sounded too loud for how soft the night was. When I got close enough to see the full patch of sky above my house, I felt my stomach drop. The glow wasn't spread out like a cloud. It was a vertical column, thin and faint, rising straight upward from a point above my roof. I couldn't see what it was attached to, if anything. It looked like the bottom of a spotlight beam, except there was no source above it. And the neighborhood stayed silent. No dogs barking, no air conditioners humming, no distant cars. Just me, standing in the yard with keys in my hand, staring at a light that wasn't supposed to be there. I stepped off the walkway onto the grass to get a clearer angle. The moment I did, the glow flickered. One soft pulse, almost like it noticed movement. And right as it flickered, every light inside my house dimmed for half a second. I could see it through the windows. The lamps, the microwave clock, even the porch light, all flickered in perfect sync. Then returned to normal. My heart was beating fast enough that I could feel it in my throat. I looked up again. The glow began to retract upward, smooth and steady, like it was being pulled by invisible strings. It rose faster than a cloud, but slower than a flare, just enough that I could track its movement without blinking. As it lifted, the air around me grew unnervingly still. It climbed to maybe 50 feet above the roof, paused, then thinned out rapidly until it was gone. No sound, no trail, no dispersal into the sky, just gone. I stood there for maybe 30 seconds, trying to decide whether to go inside or stay outside. The house looked normal through the windows, but something about walking underneath where that glow had been felt wrong. Like stepping under a ladder, but worse. Eventually, I unlocked the door and went in. The living room looked completely untouched. Nothing out of place. The air felt noticeably warmer, though. Not like the heater running, more like the room had been full of people a few minutes earlier. I checked the thermostat. Same setting as always. Trying to distract myself, I went to look at the porch security camera feed. The timeline showed motion, me arriving, me pausing in the yard, but there was a 6-second gap right in the middle of the clip. Just a jump. No corrupted frames, no error message. One moment I was standing still, and in the next I had shifted a few feet, like the camera momentarily skipped forward. I replayed it 3 times, feeling my skin prickle more each time. Then I switched to the backyard camera. It had a gap too, exactly 6 seconds long at the exact same moment. The timestamp didn't pause. It jumped. I stared at the screen for a long time, feeling this rising sense of pressure that had nowhere to go. I wanted to tell myself the camera's glitched. That's all. Cheap equipment, cold night, whatever. But both cameras glitching in the same 6-second window, right when the light flickered above the house. It felt too precise. Eventually, I opened the back door to check outside. Cold air hit me, but not evenly. Near the steps, the air felt normal, but 2 feet away, dead center in the yard, it felt warmer by a few degrees. Not warm enough to see steam or anything, but enough that it stood out sharply in the night. I stepped forward until I reached it. The warm spot was circular, maybe 6 feet across. Grass in that patch looked slightly darker than the rest, like it had been pressed down by a solid weight or heated just briefly. I didn't step into the center. I just stood at the edge, listening. The silence felt attentive, not empty. Attentive. After a few seconds, I went back inside, locked all the doors, and forced myself to sit on the couch until I felt calm enough to stand again. But the whole time, I kept thinking about how the glow had lifted upward, not spread. How it looked less like a light shining onto my house and more like something being drawn away from it. At dawn, the yard looked normal again. The warm spot was gone. The grass was crisp with frost. No sign of anything unusual. But I didn't need signs. The 6-second gap on both cameras told the story better than anything physical could. Something happened in those 6 seconds. And whatever the glow was, it wasn't lighting up my roof. It was leaving it. I was driving through the Mojave just after dusk when it happened. I'd been on the road most of the afternoon, heading toward Barstow after visiting a friend out near Needles. The sun had dropped below the hills maybe 20 minutes earlier, leaving that strange purple light that hangs over the desert before full darkness sets in. The highway was empty. Not unusual out there, but it still felt lonely in that way. The desert can miles of open land with nothing moving except the occasional tumbleweed rolling across the shoulder. I remember glancing up at the sky because one star looked unusually bright. It wasn't blinking like an airplane. It wasn't drifting like a satellite either. It just sat there, bright and steady, maybe halfway between the horizon and straight overhead. I kept driving for a few minutes, but the light stayed in the exact same spot relative to the road ahead. That's what finally made me pay closer attention. Normally, stars shift positions slowly as you drive, especially on a straight highway. This one didn't. It looked almost fixed to the sky. Then it dimmed slightly, not fading away, just softening like someone turned down a dial. I leaned forward over the steering wheel, squinting through the windshield. The moment I did, the light brightened again. That caught my attention enough that I eased off the gas. The road ahead sloped gently downward into a shallow valley, and the star, or whatever it was, hovered directly above the far side of the valley like a marker. The desert around me was silent, except for the hum of the tires on pavement. Then something strange happened. The light moved sideways. Not much. Maybe the width of a fingernail at arm's length. But it moved in a perfectly straight horizontal line and then stopped instantly. No arc, no drift, just a precise slide and halt. I actually laughed nervously at first, thinking maybe I'd imagined it, but a few seconds later it moved again. This time the opposite direction, the same exact distance, like it was correcting its position. By now I'd slowed to about 40 miles an hour. The air inside the car felt oddly thick, like the temperature had changed suddenly, even though the vents were still blowing the same cool air. The light brightened once more. That's when I realized it wasn't a star at all. The glow was coming from something reflecting light rather than producing it. Around the bright point, I could now see a faint, darker shape blocking the stars behind it. A smooth oval. I pulled onto the gravel shoulder without taking my eyes off it. The engine idled quietly while the object remained suspended over the valley. No blinking lights. No sound. Just that faint metallic reflection that made it visible against the sky. After maybe 10 seconds, the glow dimmed again until the object almost disappeared into the darkness. Then the pressure in my ears changed suddenly. It felt like being inside a descending airplane cabin, sharp enough that I had to swallow to clear it. At the same moment, the object dropped, not falling, lowering. It moved straight down toward the valley floor, stopping just above the horizon line. The movement was so smooth it looked unreal, like a computer animation rather than something physical. I leaned out the window slightly to get a better angle. The desert below it stayed completely dark. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't shining light onto the ground. Then it tilted. The reflection brightened sharply as its surface caught the last faint glow of twilight. For a brief second I could see its shape clearly. A flattened disc, smooth, featureless. It held that position for maybe 2 seconds. Then it rose, straight up, faster this time, but still silent. Within a few seconds it was back where I'd first noticed the star, hovering above the valley. The pressure in my ears released again. The object stayed there another moment before drifting upward once more. This time it didn't stop. It climbed steadily until the reflection faded and it blended into the sky. 1 second I could still track the shape blocking the stars. The next second the stars were visible again, like something had switched off the object's visibility. I sat there on the side of the highway for a while, watching the empty sky where it had been. Eventually a car passed going the opposite direction, its headlights sweeping across the desert. The normal sound of tires on asphalt broke the strange stillness, and the whole moment suddenly felt less real. I got back on the road and kept driving. About 15 miles later, I checked the clock on the dashboard. It said 7:48 p.m. But when I pulled my phone from the cup holder, the time on it read 8:03. I must have sat there longer than I thought. Still, I don't remember those extra minutes passing. All I remember is the star that wasn't a star, hovering over the valley, sliding slightly left and right like it was adjusting itself in the sky. I noticed the light because my dog refused to go outside. It was late, around 11:40 at night, and I was getting ready for bed when Milo started pacing by the back door. Normally, that meant he needed to go out, so I grabbed the leash out of habit and opened the door. He stepped onto the porch, then froze. His ears flattened and he backed up immediately like he'd run into an invisible wall. I'd never seen him do that before. Milo's a stubborn lab mix who usually bolts into the yard without thinking. I stepped outside myself to see what was bothering him. The night was still and cool. I live at the end of a small subdivision where the houses stop and a big stretch of open pasture begins. The only light usually comes from the porch lamps and whatever stars happen to be visible, but that night there was a faint glow over the field. At first, I thought it was someone driving down the dirt road that cuts across the pasture, maybe headlights bouncing off dust. But the glow didn't move like headlights. It just hovered there. A soft white haze maybe 15 or 20 feet above the grass. I walked down the steps slowly, squinting toward it. The glow wasn't bright enough to light the ground around it. It was more like a patch of mist with a faint light inside. The air between me and the field looked normal, but right around the glow, the darkness seemed thinner somehow. Behind me, Milo was whining softly at the door. I kept watching. After a few seconds, I noticed something strange. The insects had gone silent. Usually the field buzzes at night with crickets and little frogs from the drainage ditch, but the only sound now was the faint rustle of dry grass. Then the glow moved. Not quickly, just a slow sideways glide across the pasture, perfectly level with the ground. The way it moved reminded me of someone sliding a flashlight across a wall, except there was no beam, no visible source. It stopped near the center of the field. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the glow tightened. The hazy light condensed into a smaller, brighter shape. As it did, the faint outline of something darker appeared at the center, like a shadow inside the glow. I felt a strange pressure in my ears, subtle but noticeable. The shape lifted, not rising like a balloon or drifting like smoke. It went straight upward, smooth and controlled, until it was maybe 30 feet off the ground. That's when I realized the glow wasn't coming from the object. It was reflecting off it. The underside looked metallic, but dull, more like brushed steel than polished metal. My porch light caught the edge of it for a split second as it tilted slightly. It was circular. Not huge, maybe the size of a small car, and completely silent. The pressure in my ears increased suddenly, sharp enough that I swallowed to try to clear it. At the same moment, every light in my house flickered. I could see it through the kitchen window behind me. The ceiling light dimmed and brightened again in a quick pulse. The object reacted instantly. It rose faster now, straight up from the pasture until it cleared the treetops at the far end of the field. The glow around it faded as it climbed. Within seconds, it was just a pale speck against the dark sky. Then the speck blinked out. Not fading gradually, just gone. The pressure in my ears released immediately. The insects started chirping again like someone had flipped a switch. I stood there on the porch steps for a long time, staring at the empty sky. Behind me, Milo finally stepped outside, sniffed the air cautiously, and walked halfway into the yard before stopping again. He kept looking toward the middle of the field where the glow had been. The next morning, I walked out there to check. The grass in the center of the pasture was flattened in a rough circle, maybe 10 feet across. Not crushed, just pressed down like something heavy had hovered low enough to push the stems sideways. No tire tracks, no footprints, nothing else disturbed. I stood there for a while trying to figure out what could have caused it, but the longer I looked, the more the circle seemed to blend into the rest of the field. By afternoon, the grass had already started standing up again. Now, when Milo asks to go out late at night, I still open the door the same way. But every so often I catch myself looking past the yard toward the field, wondering if that faint glow might slide back across the grass again. Quiet and deliberate, like it had somewhere specific to be. I was driving through the outskirts of Fairview when it happened, taking the long way to the warehouse because I'd woken up too early and didn't feel like sitting in the parking lot waiting for my shift. The sky was still dark, deep blue fading into black, but I could tell dawn wasn't far off. The dashboard clock said 5:42 a.m. The road I was on cut between two huge empty fields on the west side of town. No houses, no streetlights, just miles of frost-coated grass and the occasional fence post. I'd driven that stretch dozens of times before and never seen another car on it that early. I was sipping lukewarm gas station coffee when I noticed the horizon doing something strange. At first, I thought it was just a weird trick of morning light. The very bottom edge of the sky, where the land met the darkness, had started to brighten, but instead of the usual faint glow spreading outward, this light rose in a straight line, a narrow column of brightness like a vertical tear in the night. Only a few inches wide from where I sat, but unmistakably real. I slowed the truck and leaned forward, squinting. The light didn't spread, it didn't soften, it just stood there, a thin, pale strip right above the eastern horizon. It pulsed once, very faintly, like someone had nudged a dimmer switch and then held steady again. I couldn't tell how far away it was. It looked distant enough to be behind the fields, maybe miles off, but the road was so flat that depth perception got weird out there. I rolled down the window to listen, even though I didn't know what I expected to hear. The air was freezing, and everything went silent. Even the truck engine felt muted somehow, like the sound wasn't carrying the way it should. The narrow glow grew a little brighter, not wider, just brighter. That tightening feeling hit my chest again, the same one I get when a storm is about to roll in, except the sky was perfectly clear. I grabbed my phone to try and take a picture, but the screen wouldn't adjust to the light. It washed out completely, like the camera didn't know how to interpret what it was seeing. When I lowered the phone, the vertical glow had already begun to retract. It moved upward, not fading, not dissolving, but rising. The bottom edge pulled away from the horizon like it was being reeled in. Smooth, too smooth, the way a curtain lifts. As it rose, the sky underneath it went dark again, seamless, untouched. I sat there motionless on the road, engine idling, watching that strip shrink until it became a tiny bar of light high above the fields. It hovered for maybe 2 seconds, then it blinked out. Not like a star, not like a plane. Just gone. The silence that followed felt unnatural, heavy, like the world was waiting for something else to happen, but couldn't decide what. I eased the truck forward again and kept glancing toward the horizon. Everything looked normal, just the earliest hint of blue creeping across the sky. But the fields on either side of me seemed darker than they should have been, like the brief glow had made the shadows cling a little longer. About half a mile down, I noticed a patch of frost on the right side of the road had melted into a perfect oval, maybe 15 feet long. Warm mist was curling upward from it, rising like steam even though the air was freezing. I slowed and stared at it through the window. There were no tire tracks leading to it, no footprints, no animals, just a smooth, dark oval in the otherwise white frost. I didn't get out of the truck. I can't explain why, but the idea of stepping near it made something in me twist. I kept moving. By the time I got to the warehouse, the sky looked normal. The guys on the morning shift were inside joking around, complaining about the cold. Nobody mentioned anything strange outside. When I tried to describe what I'd seen, one of them suggested a grain elevator spotlight reflecting off the clouds. There'd been no clouds. I didn't bring it up again. Later that afternoon, on my way home, I drove the same stretch again. The oval in the frost was gone, melted into a muddy patch like any other. No signs of heat left. Nothing remarkable. If I hadn't seen it earlier, I never would have noticed anything at all. But something else bothered me. The exact spot where the vertical glow had appeared that morning, directly across the fields, looked slightly discolored. Not the sky itself, but the air. As if the atmosphere had a faint tint or a distortion, the kind you see above asphalt on a hot day, except it was barely above freezing. A shimmer that didn't match the weather. I pulled over and watched it for a long moment. There was nothing to see, really. Nothing solid. Just this impression that the air wasn't blending naturally with the rest of the sky. When I blinked, the shimmer was gone. That night, I woke up around 3:10 a.m. without knowing why. The room was silent, the kind of silence that feels physical. I checked the window out of reflex. The horizon was dark. Nothing vertical, nothing glowing, but the sky over the eastern fields, the same direction I'd seen the strip, was just a shade lighter than it should have been. Barely noticeable. Almost like something had been there recently and left a trace. I stayed up the rest of the night without falling back asleep, waiting to see if anything would brighten again. It didn't. But in that last quiet hour before sunrise, I kept catching myself glancing toward the window, half expecting the light to return the same way it had appeared. Thin, vertical, deliberate. I noticed the silence first. I was driving home from my sister's place around 1:30 in the morning. She lives out past the edge of town where the neighborhoods give way to farmland. It's the kind of road where you can drive 10 minutes without seeing another car, especially that late. The weather had been warm during the day, but the night air cooled fast and a light haze was starting to form above the fields. My windows were cracked open and the crickets had been loud the whole drive. Then suddenly they stopped, not gradually, just cut off. At first I thought maybe I'd crossed into a stretch where there weren't any trees, but when I looked out both sides of the road, the fields and hedgerows looked exactly the same as the miles before it. The only difference was the silence. No insects, no rustling grass, not even the faint hum of power lines. The quiet felt heavy enough that I turned the radio down just to check. The engine was the only sound left. That was when something flashed above the road. Not lightning. Too small. I slowed instinctively and leaned forward over the steering wheel. About 100 yards ahead, something pale hung in the sky just above the tree line. It wasn't bright like a headlight, more like a dull white reflection, the way a piece of metal catches moonlight for a second. But it stayed there. The road ahead dipped slightly between two large fields, and the light hovered right above that dip like it was waiting for me. I slowed the car to maybe 20 miles an hour. The shape was difficult to focus on. Every time I tried to pin down the edges, they blurred into the sky. I could tell it wasn't round exactly. It looked flattened, almost like a smooth plate tipped slightly toward the road. The strange thing was how still it was. No drifting, no wobble, nothing that suggested wind. The air inside the car suddenly felt thicker. Not hot, not cold, just dense, like the pressure had shifted slightly. My ears didn't pop, but they felt like they might if the pressure changed anymore. I checked my mirrors without really thinking. The road behind me was empty. just darkness and the faint glow of my taillights reflecting off the pavement. When I looked forward again, the object had moved, not across the sky, down. It had lowered closer to the treetops without making any sound at all. That was when the headlights hit it properly. For a split second, I saw the surface clearly. A smooth, dull gray shape with no markings, no lights of its own, nothing that looked mechanical. The headlights slid across it like water over glass, reflecting back at a strange angle. Then the reflection vanished as the object tilted slightly. I instinctively lifted my foot off the gas. The car coasted forward. The thing above the trees remained completely still, but something about its position made it feel like it was watching the road. Or watching me. The silence around the fields deepened. No wind touched the tall grass, no insects returned. Even the engine noise sounded strangely muted, like the air was swallowing the sound. I considered turning around. The thought came and went in a flash, but my hand stayed steady on the wheel. I kept moving forward slowly, but unsure whether getting closer or farther away was the better choice. When I was maybe 50 yards from the dip in the road, the object moved again. This time, it rose. Not fast, just a smooth upward glide like it weighed nothing at all. It climbed straight up from the tree line until it was maybe twice as high as the tallest trees. The movement was too clean to compare to anything I'd ever seen fly. No acceleration, no tilt or banking, just a change in position. Then it stopped again. The pressure in the air released slightly, enough that I felt it in my jaw. The object hung there for maybe 3 seconds. Then it tilted once more. The moment it tilted, it seemed to vanish, not shoot away, not blink out, but disappear upward into the darkness above the haze. I actually jerked my head back to follow it, expecting to see it climbing higher into the sky. There was nothing there. The stars looked normal. The haze drifted slowly across the fields, and the crickets started up again all at once. The sound was sudden, it made me jump. I drove the rest of the way home without stopping. The pressure in the air faded gradually as I left that stretch of farmland, and by the time I reached the main road, everything felt normal again. At home, I checked the time on the dashboard, 1:42 a.m. But when I unlocked my phone to send a message to my sister, the time read 1:56, 14 minutes difference. I went back outside and looked up at the sky for a long time before going in. The stars were clear, but every now and then I caught myself staring at one patch of darkness above the fields, half expecting something smooth and gray to tilt back into view. I was driving home along County Road 18 when the sky flashed. It was one of those straight rural roads where the headlights stretch far ahead and you can see nothing but fields on both sides. I'd just left a friend's place outside town, and it was close to midnight. The air had that early autumn chill where the ground starts giving off a faint mist. At first I thought it was lightning, but lightning spreads across the sky, and this didn't. The entire road ahead lit up like someone had taken a photograph with a giant flashbulb somewhere far in front of me. A hard, white burst of light that lasted maybe half a second, then everything went dark again. I slowed down instinctively, scanning the sky for clouds. There weren't any. Just clear stars and a thin strip of haze near the horizon. A few seconds later, it happened again. Flash. Same direction, same bright white light. But this time I noticed something strange. The fields on both sides of the road lit up evenly, but the sky didn't. The stars were still visible even during the flash, like the light wasn't coming from the sky at all. It felt like the source was lower. I rolled down my window and leaned out slightly as I kept driving. The air smelled like damp soil and cold grass. The road dipped gently ahead, and beyond that dip, I could see the faint outline of the tree line where the farmland ended. The third flash came right as I reached the dip, but instead of fading immediately, the light held for a second longer. In that moment, I saw it, something hovering above the far end of the field. At first, my brain couldn't make sense of the shape. It wasn't glowing like the flashes suggested. It was darker than the sky, a flat silhouette suspended above the crops. My headlights caught the underside just enough to reveal a smooth surface. No rivets, no wings, no visible structure, just a dark oval. The bright flash suddenly stopped. The road returned to its normal dim yellow from my headlights. But the shape was still there. I slowed to a crawl. The object hung maybe 30 feet above the ground, perfectly still. I couldn't judge its size properly because of the distance, but it had to be big, bigger than any car, probably wider than the road itself. The strangest thing was the silence. No engine noise, no wind, no electrical hum, just the faint ticking of my engine cooling as I eased off the gas. Then something changed. The air pressure inside the car shifted suddenly. My ears popped so sharply that I winced. At the same moment, the object tilted slightly. That tilt was enough for my headlights to slide across the underside, and for a brief second I saw a faint metallic sheen along the surface. Not reflective like chrome, more like brushed steel catching a soft glow. A thin white line appeared along the edge, not a light turning on, more like a seam opening. The line brightened and the same flash from earlier burst outward again, only now I could see it coming from the object itself. It wasn't a beam. It was more like the entire underside emitted a pulse of white light all at once. I threw my arm up instinctively to shield my eyes. By the time I looked again, the object had moved. Not forward, not sideways, up. It rose straight upward with a smooth motion that didn't resemble any aircraft I'd ever seen. No acceleration curve, no climbing angle, just a steady upward glide. Within seconds it was above the height of the tallest trees. Then it paused. For a moment, I could see it clearly against the stars, a dark disk with a faint white glow tracing its lower edge, and then it simply vanished into the night. Not shooting away like a meteor, just gone. The pressure in my ears released immediately. The crickets in the fields started up again like someone flipped a switch. I sat there on the road for a full minute, staring up at the empty sky where it had been. Eventually, a distant truck came over the hill behind me, its headlights sweeping across the fields. I pulled forward and continued driving home, trying to convince myself I'd missed the distance or that the flashes had been some kind of agricultural equipment. But when I passed the field where the object had hovered, something else caught my attention. A wide circular patch of the crops had been flattened, perfectly round, no tractor tracks leading to it, no broken stems scattered around, just a smooth circle pressed gently into the field like something heavy had hovered there without quite touching the ground. I didn't stop to look closer. I kept driving until the houses of town started appearing again, and the road filled with normal streetlights. Even now, when I drive that road at night, I sometimes catch myself watching the sky ahead. Not for flashes, but for the moment, the stars might suddenly disappear behind something dark and silent hanging over the fields. I first noticed something was wrong with the sky because the stars disappeared. I was out behind my house around midnight, sitting on a folding chair in the yard. I live on the edge of a small town in southern Colorado where the houses thin out quickly into open land. Behind my place, there's nothing but scrub and a long stretch of desert that runs toward the hills. It's one of the few spots where the night sky still looks the way it's supposed to, dense with stars. That night was calm and clear. No wind, no clouds, just the kind of quiet you get when the desert finally cools down after a hot day. I'd been sitting there maybe 20 minutes when I realized a patch of the sky looked empty. Not darker exactly, just blank. At first I thought it was a cloud moving across the stars, but the edges of it were too sharp. Clouds blur things. This was more like a section of the sky had been erased. A clean oval shape where the stars simply weren't visible. I leaned forward in the chair, squinting. The rest of the sky looked perfectly normal. Thousands of tiny points of light everywhere except that one smooth gap. The longer I stared at it, the more it started to feel wrong. Not just visually wrong, but physically unsettling, the way something feels when it's out of place, but you can't explain why. Then the oval shifted, just slightly. It slid sideways across the stars, and as it moved, the stars reappeared behind it, while disappearing in front of it. That's when it clicked in my mind that I wasn't looking at empty sky. Something was blocking the stars. Something huge. My stomach tightened and I stood up without meaning to. The movement of the thing overhead was so slow and smooth that it took a few seconds for my brain to accept what I was seeing. The shape had no lights, no blinking markers. Nothing except the absence of stars across its surface. It drifted silently over the yard like a shadow cast by something enormous above the atmosphere, except it wasn't high up like a cloud. I could feel somehow that it was lower, much lower. The air around me felt heavier as it passed overhead. My ears started to buzz faintly, like the pressure change you get when an airplane descends. I remember glancing toward the street, half expecting someone else to be outside noticing it too. But the neighborhood looked completely still. Every house dark, every window black. When I looked back up, the shape was directly above me. The outline became clearer against the stars, an enormous disc or oval, smooth and uniform. The edges were faint but visible where the starlight cut off. It moved so slowly that the shift was almost hypnotic. Then something else happened. The insects stopped. The desert usually hums at night. Crickets, beetles, tiny things rustling in the brush. But as the shadow passed overhead, that sound faded until the only thing I could hear was my own breathing. The buzzing pressure in my ears grew stronger. I stepped backward toward the house, still staring upward. For a moment, I thought I saw a faint glow along the underside of the object. Not bright enough to light the ground, just a soft gray haze that seemed to ripple across its surface. It reminded me of heat shimmer over asphalt. Then the glow faded again. The massive shadow kept drifting west across the desert, swallowing and releasing stars as it moved. When the rear edge of it finally cleared my yard, the insects started up again almost instantly. The sound returned in a wave, filling the silence so abruptly that I actually flinched. The pressure in my ears eased too. I stood there for another minute, watching the object continue toward the hills. Once it moved farther away, its outline became harder to see. The stars behind it made the edges blur until the shape blended into the night. Eventually, the stars looked normal again. No blank oval, no shadow. Just the sky the way it always looks out here. I went back inside, poured a glass of water, and tried to convince myself it was some kind of trick of my eyes. Maybe a cloud so thin it didn't reflect light. Maybe fatigue after a long day. But when I checked the time on my phone, something didn't add up. I'd gone outside at 11:52. The phone now read 12:27. 35 minutes had passed. The thing had taken maybe 2 minutes to cross the sky. I went back outside once more and looked toward the hills where it had disappeared. The stars above them looked perfectly ordinary. But every so often, I still catch myself staring at that stretch of sky, wondering how something that big could move over a town without making a single sound. I noticed the first strange thing because my radio cut out. I was driving home from a late shift at the hospital, taking the back road along Lake Alder because it had shaved 10 minutes off the usual route. It was just after midnight, and the weather had that damp chill that settles over the water in early fall. Fog wasn't thick enough to hide the road, but it hovered low over the lake like breath on glass. The radio had been playing quietly the whole drive. Nothing special, just late night talk. Then, without warning, it went dead silent. Not static, not fading, just silence. I reached down and tapped the volume knob, thinking the station dropped out, but the screen still showed the same channel. The signal bars were full. The speakers just weren't producing anything. A few seconds later, my ears popped. It felt exactly like driving up a mountain too fast, that sudden pressure shift where everything muffles for a moment. Except this road was flat, and I'd driven it hundreds of times without anything like that happening. I swallowed, trying to clear it, but the pressure stayed. That's when I saw the light. It wasn't in the sky at first. It was reflecting off the lake. About 50 yards ahead, a faint white glow spread across the water like someone had dropped a spotlight beneath the surface. The lake itself looked calm. No ripples, then no boats. But the reflection slid slowly across the fog like something underneath was moving. I slowed the car instinctively. The glow wasn't bright enough to light the trees or the road. It only touched the fog and the water, and it moved in a perfectly straight line parallel to the shoreline. My first thought was a boat with underwater lights, but there were no navigation lights, no engine sound, no wake trailing behind. The glow kept drifting until it lined up with the stretch of road where I'd stopped. Then it stopped too. My headlights shone out over the guardrail, illuminating the fog in pale yellow beams, but the white glow beneath the surface looked completely separate from them, almost colder. The radio suddenly crackled. Not voices, just a short burst of clicking noises that sounded mechanical, almost rhythmic. Then the silence returned. I leaned forward in my seat and squinted through the windshield. That's when the glow lifted. Not out of the water exactly. It was more like the reflection rose first. The bright patch on the lake shrank into a tighter shape, then lifted upward through the fog. For a moment, it looked like a sphere of pale light hovering just above the waterline. The fog around it seemed to thin as it moved, revealing glimpses of something darker at the center. I couldn't make out any shape, just a sense that the glow had depth. The air pressure inside the car tightened again. My ears popped a second time, harder this round. The light drifted slowly toward the road. No sound, no rush of air, just a steady glide like something floating underwater. When it reached the guardrail, it stopped. I held my breath without realizing it. The light hung there maybe 15 feet above the ground, not flickering, not spinning, completely still. My dashboard clock flickered. For a split second, the numbers went blank, then returned like nothing happened. The light dimmed slightly, not fading away, more like it was adjusting its brightness, the way your eyes narrow when something moves too close. Then it rose straight upward. The movement was so smooth it didn't look like acceleration. It simply changed position, climbing through the fog until it was higher than the treetops. For a moment, I could see it clearly against the darker sky. A pale white point. Then it dimmed again. By the time it reached the height of the low clouds, it blended in completely. 1 second it was there. The next it looked like part of the fog. The pressure in my ears released all at once. The radio came back on mid-sentence. The host's voice continuing like nothing had happened. I sat there for a minute with my hands still on the steering wheel, trying to decide if I'd actually seen what I thought I'd seen. Eventually, I pulled away and kept driving. About a mile down the road, I noticed something else that made my stomach tighten again. The lake behind me was completely dark, no glow, no lingering reflection, just black water and fog drifting over it like before. When I got home, the dashboard clock said 12:47 a.m., but when I checked my phone inside the house, it read 1:02, 15 minutes gone somewhere along that road. I've driven that stretch a few times since, always late at night. The fog still rolls in from the lake the same way. The radio works fine. The pressure in my ears never changes. But every time I pass that spot by the guardrail, I glance out over the water, just in case the reflection shows up again first. I was driving the last stretch of highway before my town when I noticed the traffic lights acting strangely. It was around 2 a.m., the kind of hour when the roads are empty and every intersection sits blinking yellow. I'd just finished a late shift at a warehouse and was heading home along the main road that runs through a few miles of open farmland before the first houses start appearing. Normally there are 3 intersections along that stretch, each with a tall traffic signal hanging over the road. At night they're supposed to blink yellow for the highway and red for the cross street. But the first light I passed was completely dark. Not blinking, not red or yellow, just dead. I slowed a little and rolled through the intersection, assuming maybe there was a power issue in that area. But when I reached the second light about half a mile later, it was dark too. That one caught my attention. The street lights nearby were still on, glowing normally over the empty road. Only the traffic signals had gone black. As I drove under it, something flashed in my rearview mirror. I glanced back and saw a faint white glow behind the intersection I'd just passed. At first I thought it might be another car approaching from the cross street, but the glow didn't spread across the pavement the way headlights do. It hovered above the road. I slowed the truck and looked again. The glow was rising slowly upward from the middle of the intersection, like something lifting off from directly above the traffic light. I pulled onto the shoulder and stopped. The object became clearer as it climbed. It wasn't bright enough to illuminate the ground. The light seemed to cling to the underside of something darker, an oval shape that blocked the stars behind it. For a second I thought it might be a drone, but it was far too large. The thing hovered maybe 50 feet above the intersection. The entire area felt unnaturally quiet. Even the distant hum of power lines had faded. The engine of my truck sounded muffled, like the air itself was absorbing the noise. Then the radio shut off. One moment, music was playing quietly through the speakers. The next moment, nothing. No static, just silence. The dashboard lights dimmed slightly at the same time, then returned to normal. I stepped out of the truck and leaned against the door, staring up at the object. The underside looked smooth and metallic, reflecting just enough starlight to reveal its shape. I couldn't see any seams or panels, no blinking lights like an aircraft would have, just that faint white glow hugging the bottom edge. The pressure in my ears changed suddenly. It felt like the air around me had gotten heavier. I swallowed to clear it, but the sensation stayed. The object drifted sideways across the intersection without tilting or rotating. The movement was slow but perfectly steady, like it was sliding across invisible rails in the air. When it reached the center of the road directly in front of me, it stopped again. For a moment it hovered there. Then the glow brightened. Not much, just enough to outline the circular edge more clearly. I could see faint concentric rings on the underside, like patterns pressed into metal. The pressure in my ears increased sharply. At that exact moment, the traffic lights behind me flickered. I heard the faint click of the signal boxes activating. The red and yellow lights blinked on all at once. The object reacted instantly. It rose straight upward, not accelerating like a helicopter or drone, just lifting smoothly into the sky without any sound at all. Within seconds, it was above the height of the power lines, then higher than the streetlights. The glow dimmed as it climbed, leaving only the dark oval shape against the stars. And then it was gone. The pressure in my ears released immediately. The radio inside the truck crackled back to life, continuing the song exactly where it had cut out. The traffic lights resumed blinking normally above the empty road. I stood there for another minute, staring at the sky, but there was nothing left to see. When I finally got back into the truck, I glanced at the clock on the dashboard. It said 2:18 a.m. But when I checked my phone, the time read 2:31. 13 minutes had passed while I was sitting there watching something lift off from the middle of a quiet intersection where the traffic lights had all gone dark. I noticed the fog behaving strangely before I saw anything in the sky. It was early morning, around 4:50 a.m., and I was driving through a stretch of farmland outside of Salina. I'd been on the road for about an hour, heading to a job site before sunrise. That part of Kansas is flat enough that you can usually see miles in every direction, but that morning a low fog had settled across the fields. It wasn't thick enough to hide the road, just thin layers drifting over the ground like slow-moving smoke. My headlights cut through it easily, lighting the pavement and the edges of the cornfields. At first, everything looked normal. Then I noticed a section of fog ahead that wasn't moving. Every other patch of mist drifted slowly across the fields in the breeze. But about 200 yards ahead, a tall column of fog stood perfectly still, rising straight up from the ground like a pale pillar. I slowed the truck. The column looked unnatural. Fog spreads and curls. This thing held a shape, narrow at the base and widening slightly as it rose maybe 50 or 60 feet into the air. I remember thinking maybe there was some kind of heat source out there, equipment or a generator producing steam. But the column was too symmetrical. As I got closer, the headlights caught something inside it. A faint white glow. Not bright enough to illuminate the fog around it. Just a dull light sitting at the center of the column. The glow shifted slightly as I approached, and the fog around it rippled outward like water disturbed by something underneath. I slowed the truck to a crawl and rolled down the window. The air smelled damp and cold, but there was something else mixed in, like ozone, the smell you sometimes notice after lightning. The column of fog tightened. Instead of spreading in the breeze, it pulled inward toward the light. That's when I realized the fog wasn't forming the column. It was being drawn to it. The glow rose slowly inside the mist, climbing upward until it reached the top of the column. Then the fog collapsed. Not drifting apart, but falling away all at once like something had turned off whatever was holding it together. For the first time, I could see the object clearly. It hovered about 30 feet above the ground. The shape was smooth and oval, maybe the size of a pickup truck. It didn't shine or blink. The faint glow I'd seen earlier seemed to come from underneath it, reflecting softly off the fog that had surrounded it. The strangest part was how quiet everything had become. Even the wind had stopped. The cornfields on both sides of the road were completely still. I stepped out of the truck without really thinking about it. The moment my feet touched the gravel shoulder, a pressure built inside my ears. Not painful, just tight, like the atmosphere had thickened. The object drifted sideways across the field. It didn't tilt or bank like an aircraft. It just slid smoothly through the air, maintaining the same height above the ground. The faint glow beneath it brightened slightly. For a second, I saw the underside clearly. Concentric circular lines etched into the metal surface like rings spreading outward from the center. Then the glow dimmed again. The object paused directly over the cornfield. The pressure in my ears increased suddenly, strong enough that I had to swallow twice to clear it. Then it rose. Straight up, no sound, no rush of air. The fog on the ground beneath it stirred gently as if something had lifted away from it. Within seconds, the object climbed above the low morning haze. The faint glow faded until the shape became just a dark silhouette against the early sky. Then it vanished completely. The pressure in my ears released instantly. The breeze returned to the fields, and the fog resumed, drifting slowly across the ground as if nothing unusual had interrupted it. I stood there for another minute, staring upward. The sky looked perfectly normal. When I got back into the truck and checked the dashboard clock, it read 5:12. I was sure it had been just before 5 when I first noticed the fog column. I don't remember standing there that long, but the road behind me was now covered with fresh fog again, as if the column I'd seen had never existed. I noticed the wind turbines first. I was driving home along a rural highway that cuts through a wind farm about 20 miles outside town. It was late, around 1:15 in the morning, and the road was empty except for my truck and miles of blinking red lights from the turbines stretching across the hills. Normally, those turbines spin constantly. Even on calm nights, the blades move slowly because the wind never completely stops out there. But that night, every single one of them was still. The blades were frozen in place against the sky like giant black crosses. I slowed down a little, trying to figure out if I'd just never seen them shut down before. Maybe they stopped overnight for maintenance or something. But the strange thing wasn't just that they were still. It was the silence. The wind itself hadn't stopped. I could see the grass along the roadside moving in the headlights, but the turbines, hundreds of feet tall, weren't reacting to it at all. As I drove deeper into the wind farm, the red lights on the towers blinked normally, one after another across the hills. Then something brighter appeared beyond them. At first I thought it was a distant aircraft coming toward the turbines, but the light didn't move like a plane. It hovered low above the ridgeline behind the towers, glowing a soft white. I slowed the truck even more. The light was hard to focus on. It didn't flare like headlights or blink like aircraft lights. It just stayed steady, like a star that had somehow dropped down closer to the earth. Then the turbines closest to it moved. Not spinning, turning. Each one rotated slightly on its base, the long blades shifting position as if the towers themselves were being pulled toward the light. I actually stopped the truck in the middle of the road. The turbines weren't built to move that way, without wind forcing the blades around, and even then, they spin, not twist their whole structure. But 3 of them slowly turned until their blades faced directly toward the hovering light. The rest of the turbines stayed frozen. The white glow brightened slightly. At the same moment, my truck's radio cut out. Not static, just silence. The dashboard lights dimmed briefly, then returned to normal. I stepped out of the truck without shutting off the engine. The air felt strange, thick and still, even though the grass continued moving in the breeze. My ears had that faint pressure feeling you get when descending in an airplane. The hovering light drifted sideways. As it moved, the 3 turbines that had rotated began turning again, slowly realigning themselves to follow it. It looked almost like they were tracking it. Then the glow dipped lower. For a second, I thought it was landing behind the ridge, but instead, it slid forward into clearer view between 2 towers. That's when I realized the light wasn't the object. It was reflecting off it. The thing itself was darker than the sky, a smooth oval shape that blocked out the stars behind it. The glow was just moonlight or starlight sliding across its surface. The object hovered maybe 100 feet above the ridge, completely silent. The pressure in my ears increased suddenly, sharp enough that I swallowed to clear it. The turbines that had been turning stopped again instantly. Then the object moved, straight up, not accelerating the way helicopters or drones do, just rising smoothly like gravity didn't matter to it. As it climbed, the glow around its edge brightened briefly, outlining the underside. I could see a faint circular pattern there, like rings etched into metal. Within seconds, it was above the height of the tallest turbines. Then it tilted slightly and vanished, not shooting off into the distance, just fading into the dark sky until the stars behind it reappeared. The pressure in my ears disappeared immediately. The radio inside the truck crackled back to life. Behind me, one of the turbines started spinning again with a low mechanical groan. Then another. Within a few seconds, the entire wind farm had returned to normal, the blades turning slowly in the night wind, like nothing had happened. I stood there for a minute longer, staring at the empty sky. When I finally got back into the truck, the dashboard clock caught my eye. It said 1:27 a.m., but I'd stopped on that road at 1:15. 12 minutes had passed, and I could have sworn the whole thing lasted maybe 2. I was out on the lake when it happened. It was early morning, just before sunrise, the time when everything is quiet but the sky hasn't started brightening yet. I'd launched my small fishing boat around 5 a.m., hoping to catch the first bite before the wind picked up. The water was perfectly calm, almost glassy, and the shoreline was still hidden in that blue-gray darkness that hangs over the lake before dawn. I just dropped my line in when something strange caught my eye. The water ahead of the boat looked lit. Not from the sky, from below. At first it was faint, like moonlight reflecting off ripples, except the lake surface was completely flat. The glow appeared about 20 feet in front of me, a dull white shape spreading slowly under the surface like something drifting just beneath the water. I leaned forward in my seat, trying to see through the dark water. The glow moved. It slid quietly beneath the boat's bow, not disturbing the water at all. No wake, no bubbles, nothing that suggested anything solid was pushing through the lake. Then it stopped directly under me. The entire bottom of the boat lit up with a pale, diffused light. It wasn't bright enough to shine upward into my eyes, but I could see the outlines of the seats and the cooler reflected on the inside of the hull. The water around the boat glowed faintly like a giant lantern had been lowered underneath. My first thought was some kind of large fish or maybe a diver with a light, but the lake was too deep there and the light was too big. It filled an area wider than my boat. The glow stayed still for maybe 5 seconds. Then it began to move again. Not away. Up. The light rose toward the surface slowly, like something was lifting it from below. My stomach tightened as the glow brightened and condensed. I could see the shape becoming more defined beneath the water, circular, smooth, and darker at the center. The water around it didn't ripple. It just parted. The surface bulged upward gently as something pushed against it from below. The glow intensified until it was almost white. Then the surface broke. A circular object emerged silently from the lake. Water slid off its edges in thin sheets, but there was no splash, no disturbance beyond a slight ripple spreading outward. The object rose a few feet above the water and stopped. It looked like a flat disc, not shiny, not glowing, just a smooth gray surface reflecting the faint light of the coming dawn. The glow I'd seen underwater faded immediately once it cleared the surface, like the light had only existed beneath it. The object hovered maybe 10 feet away from my boat. The lake stayed perfectly calm. Even the small ripples from its emergence seemed to stop halfway across the surface, as if the water didn't want to move. I sat frozen, gripping the sides of the seat. The air felt thick and heavy. My ears started to buzz faintly, like the pressure was changing around me. The disc tilted slightly. As it did, I caught a brief glimpse of the underside, a darker circular center surrounded by a thin ring that looked almost translucent. Then the ring brightened. A soft white line appeared along the edge of the object, the same dull glow I'd seen under the water earlier. The pressure in my ears increased suddenly. The boat shifted gently beneath me, not rocked by waves, but by something in the air itself. Then the disc rose, straight up, no sound. No rush of wind. It lifted from the lake with the same quiet smoothness it had used to emerge. Within seconds, it was above the tree line at the far end of the lake. The white ring dimmed again. By the time the object reached the height of the low clouds forming in the early morning sky, it blended into the gray light of dawn and disappeared completely. The buzzing in my ears stopped. The water around the boat finally rippled outward in small circles, like the lake had been holding its breath and was just now letting it go. I stayed there for a long time, staring at the empty sky. Eventually, the sun started creeping over the hills, and the lake turned the normal colors of morning, silver, then pale gold. The spot where the object had risen looked exactly like the rest of the water. No bubbles, no disturbance, just calm surface stretching in every direction. I pulled my fishing line up and realized the hook was gone. The line had snapped cleanly near the lure. I don't remember it happening, and I don't remember hearing anything when it did. I was halfway through a night shift at the gas station when it happened. The place sits at the edge of a small town where the highway cuts through miles of farmland. After midnight, it's usually dead quiet. Maybe one or two trucks stop for fuel, but most of the time it's just me, the buzzing fluorescent lights, and the hum of the drink coolers behind the counter. That night had been especially slow. Around 2:10 a.m., I stepped outside to stretch my legs and get some air. The sky was clear, and the stars were bright enough that you could see the outlines of the fields across the road. I remember thinking how still everything felt. Even the wind had died down. Then one of the parking lot lights flickered. It was the tall pole near the edge of the lot. The bulb dimmed for a second, then came back to full brightness. I didn't think much of it at first. Those lights do that sometimes when the wiring gets old. But a second later, every light on the property flickered together. The canopy lights over the pumps, the sign by the road, even the small bulbs inside the station. They all dimmed at the exact same moment, then returned to normal. I looked up automatically, expecting to see a transformer blowing somewhere nearby. Instead, I saw a faint glow moving across the sky above the highway. At first, it looked like a low cloud reflecting moonlight, but the moon wasn't out. The glow drifted slowly toward the station until it was directly overhead. As it got closer, I realized the light wasn't spreading across the sky. It was reflecting off something big. The shape was hard to see at first because it blended into the darkness, but as it moved over the parking lot lights, I could make out the outline, a smooth oval blocking the stars behind it. I stepped farther out into the lot for a better look. The object hung maybe 100 feet above the ground. It didn't make any sound. No engine noise, no wind, nothing. The only thing I could hear was the faint buzzing of the gas station lights. Then, those lights dimmed again. This time, they stayed dim. The entire lot took on a dull, yellowish glow. The underside of the object reflected just enough of that light for me to see it clearly. It looked metallic. Not shiny, but smooth, like brushed steel. There were no windows, no markings, just a circular pattern etched into the center of the underside, rings spreading outward like ripples in water. The air around me suddenly felt heavy. My ears popped sharply, and I had to swallow to clear them. At the same moment, the pumps behind me shut off with a soft click. The digital displays went blank. The entire station went silent. The object lowered slightly. Not enough to change its shape, just enough that the glow around its edge brightened. I took a step backward without realizing it. For a moment, the thing just hovered there. Then it tilted. The motion was subtle, but the change in angle caused the parking lot lights to reflect differently across its surface. The faint glow shifted from white to a pale blue along the edge. Then it rose, straight up. The movement was smooth and controlled, like it weighed nothing at all. Within seconds, it cleared the height of the highway sign. Then, the power came back. Every light on the property snapped back to full brightness at the same instant. The pumps beeped as their screens restarted. The sudden noise made me jump. I looked up again just in time to see the object disappear into the sky. Not shooting away like a meteor, just fading upward until the stars filled in behind it. I stood there for another minute trying to process what I'd seen. Eventually, a semi-truck pulled off the highway and rolled up to the pumps like any normal night. The driver stepped out and asked if the power had just gone out. I told him it flickered for a second. He nodded and started fueling like nothing unusual had happened. Later, when I checked the security cameras inside, there was a gap in the footage. Exactly 9 seconds missing. The screen jumped from 2:43:33 to 2:44:42 with nothing recorded in between. But I know the thing hovered over the station much longer than 9 seconds. Because I remember standing in the parking lot, staring up at something huge and silent, blocking out the stars while every machine around me shut down. I was driving home through the canyon when the headlights hit something that shouldn't have been there. It was just after midnight, and I'd taken the narrow 2-lane road that cuts through the foothills instead of the highway. It's a quiet route, mostly used by locals, and at that hour, it's usually empty. The canyon walls rise steep on both sides, so the sky above looks like a long strip of stars between dark rock. My headlights were the only light on the road. About 10 minutes into the drive, the beam caught something metallic hanging in the air ahead. At first, I thought it was a road sign reflecting back at me, but the reflection was too high, maybe 20 or 30 feet above the asphalt, and it didn't have the sharp rectangular shape of a sign. I slowed down. The reflection shifted slightly as the car moved, revealing a smooth, curved surface. That's when I realized it wasn't attached to anything. It was hovering over the road. I eased off the gas and coasted closer, squinting through the windshield. The thing was dark against the sky, almost invisible, except where my headlights slid across its underside. The surface looked dull gray, like brushed metal. No lights, no markings, just a wide oval shape suspended silently above the canyon floor. I slowed to a crawl and rolled the window down. The night air rushed in, cold and dry, carrying the faint smell of dust and sagebrush. Normally, the canyon echoes with the sound of insects and wind brushing against the rocks, but at that moment, everything had gone still. Even the engine sounded quieter somehow. As I got closer, the headlights illuminated more of the underside. I could see faint circular lines etched into it, rings spreading outward from a darker center. The object hovered maybe 30 feet above the road. Then the pressure in my ears changed suddenly. It felt like driving quickly up a mountain pass, that tight sensation that makes you swallow to clear your ears. I did exactly that. The moment I did, the object moved. Not forward, up. It rose straight toward the strip of sky above the canyon walls. The motion was smooth and controlled, almost too smooth, like it wasn't affected by gravity at all. My headlights followed it upward until the beam no longer reached. The underside faded back into darkness, but I could still see its silhouette blocking out the stars. The pressure in my ears increased sharply for a second. Then the object tilted slightly. A faint white glow appeared along its edge, soft and thin, like moonlight reflecting off polished metal. The glow brightened for a moment. Then the object accelerated upward, not gradually, instantly. 1 second it hovered above the canyon. The next, it shot straight into the sky so fast that the shape blurred into a thin streak of light before disappearing completely. The pressure in my ears released immediately. The insects started chirping again. The wind brushed through the canyon grass like someone had flipped a switch. I sat there in the middle of the road with the engine idling, staring at the empty strip of sky between the canyon walls. After a minute or two, I realized my hands were still gripping the steering wheel tightly. Eventually, I drove the rest of the way home. When I pulled into my driveway, I glanced at the clock on the dashboard. It read 12:41 a.m., but when I checked my phone after stepping out of the car, the time was 12:56. 15 minutes had passed somewhere along that canyon road. I don't remember driving during that time. All I remember is the moment the headlights reflected off something metallic hanging in the air where nothing should have been. I was the only one awake in the house when it happened. It was just after 3 a.m. and I'd gotten up to grab a glass of water. I live in a small 2-story house at the end of a cul-de-sac, and at that hour the whole neighborhood is usually silent. No cars, no dogs barking, nothing. As I stood in the kitchen filling the glass, I heard a low humming sound. It wasn't loud, more like a vibration than a noise, the kind you feel before you actually hear it. At first I thought maybe the refrigerator compressor had kicked on, but the hum didn't come from the kitchen. It seemed to come from above the house. I walked over to the back window and looked out into the yard. The grass and fence were barely visible in the darkness, lit faintly by the porch light. Everything looked normal at first. Then, the porch light dimmed. Just slightly. I stared at it, thinking maybe the bulb was about to burn out. But the dimming didn't stop. The light continued to fade until the entire yard was bathed in a soft gray glow instead of the usual yellow. That's when I noticed the sky. A faint white light hung directly above the roofline. Not bright enough to illuminate the neighborhood, but strong enough to cast a dull reflection across the top of the fence and the leaves of the trees. I stepped onto the back patio slowly. The humming sound grew stronger. It felt like it was vibrating through the ground rather than traveling through the air. I looked straight up. Something large was hovering above the house. At first, I could only see its outline where it blocked the stars. But as my eyes adjusted, the shape became clearer. A wide, circular object. Smooth and dark. The gray glow came from its underside, outlining the edges just enough for me to see the curve of it against the sky. It wasn't spinning. It wasn't drifting. It was just hanging there silently. The humming increased in pitch slightly, and the pressure in my ears changed like I was riding an elevator. I instinctively covered one ear and swallowed to clear it. The object lowered a few feet. Not fast, just a controlled descent that brought it closer to the roof. The gray glow brightened slightly. For a moment, I could see faint circular patterns across the underside, rings spreading outward from the center like grooves in metal. Then every light inside the house flickered. I could see it through the kitchen window behind me. The ceiling lights blinked once. The microwave display went dark for a split second. The humming reached its loudest point, and then it stopped, completely. The sudden silence made the air feel hollow. The object remained perfectly still above the roof for maybe 2 seconds. Then it began to rise, straight upward. The glow beneath it faded as it climbed, and the stars slowly reappeared around its edges. Within seconds, the circular shape blended back into the darkness of the sky. The porch light brightened again. The normal yellow color returned to the yard. I stood there staring upward for a long time. The sky looked empty again. When I finally went back inside, I checked the clock on the microwave. It read 3:27 a.m. But when I had walked into the kitchen for water, it had been 3:08. I don't remember standing outside for nearly 20 minutes. And the strangest part is that no one else in the house woke up, not even the dog, who usually barks at the slightest noise. It was as if whatever had hovered over the roof had kept the entire house asleep while I watched it leave. I was the last one to leave the construction site that night. We were pouring concrete for a new warehouse just outside town, and the crew had stayed late finishing a section of foundation before the temperature dropped too much. By the time everyone packed up and left, it was just me doing a final walk around to make sure the equipment was shut down. The place was quiet in that strange way construction sites get after dark. Huge open slabs of concrete, stacks of steel beams, and nothing but distant highway noise in the background. It was close to midnight. I remember looking up at the sky while I locked the tool trailer because the stars were unusually bright. Out there, with no buildings around yet, the whole sky felt wide open. That's when one of the stars started moving. At first, it looked like a satellite drifting slowly across the sky. I watched it casually while finishing the lock on the trailer door. But then the light stopped. Satellites don't stop. The point of light hung perfectly still above the unfinished building frame. I leaned back against the trailer and kept watching. A few seconds later, the light moved again, but not in a straight line. It slid sideways in a tight arc, like someone drawing a small circle in the sky. Then it stopped again. The movement was too precise, too controlled. I stepped out into the open part of the site where I had a better view of the sky. The light was lower now, still high above the steel framework, but definitely closer than it had been before. It didn't blink like an aircraft beacon. It stayed steady, bright white against the dark. Then something else caught my attention. The big tower crane at the center of the site had stopped moving. Earlier that evening, a light breeze had been slowly rotating the long arm of the crane. It's normal, The wind pushes it around when the brake isn't locked. But now the arm was perfectly still. The breeze was still blowing. I could feel it against my jacket, yet the crane hadn't moved an inch. The white light above the sight dimmed slightly. Then the stars around it disappeared. That's when I realized I wasn't looking at a point of light anymore. Something huge was blocking the sky. A massive dark shape drifted silently above the steel skeleton of the warehouse. The faint white glow I'd been watching earlier now looked like a reflection sliding along its underside. I stepped backward without thinking. The thing was enormous, at least the width of the building frame, maybe wider. The shape was smooth and circular, almost perfectly flat along the bottom. The glow traced along the edge like a thin halo. As it moved overhead, the sound of the highway faded. Even the wind seemed to soften. Then my ears started ringing. It wasn't a loud sound, just a high-pitched pressure like standing near heavy machinery. The object slowed directly above the crane. For a moment, it hovered there. Then the glow beneath it brightened. The light wasn't a beam. It spread across the underside like something powering up. The crane's long arm twitched slightly. Just a small movement, but enough that I noticed. Then it stopped again. The pressure in my ears grew stronger. I could feel it in my jaw. The glow dimmed suddenly, and the object rose. Straight up, the movement was so smooth it barely looked real. Within seconds, it climbed higher than the crane's tower, higher than the temporary floodlights around the site. The white glow faded until the shape became just a darker patch against the stars. Then the stars filled back in behind it. The ringing in my ears stopped instantly. The crane arm creaked and rotated slightly in the wind again like nothing had happened. I stood there for another minute staring upward. Everything looked normal again. When I finally walked back to my truck and checked the time on the dashboard, it read 12:36. But I knew I'd started my final walk around at 12:12. Nearly 25 minutes had passed. I don't remember standing there that long. I only remember watching that light trace along the underside of something big enough to cover half the sky above an empty construction site. I noticed the cattle first. I was driving along a rural road just before sunrise, heading out to check a few fence lines on the family property. My parents own a stretch of grazing land about 10 miles outside of town, and every so often I make the early trip out there before work. That morning, the sky had that dim gray color it gets before the sun actually rises. The land was still dark, but the horizon was starting to brighten a little. As I came around a bend in the road, my headlights swept across one of the lower pastures. Every cow in the field was standing perfectly still, not grazing, not lying down, just standing, and they were all facing the same direction. That alone was strange enough to make me slow down. Normally, cattle move around constantly in the morning, especially when they hear a truck coming down the road, but none of them reacted to my headlights. They were staring toward the far side of the pasture where the land dipped slightly before rising again toward the hills. I eased the truck onto the gravel shoulder and cut the engine. The silence hit immediately. Usually you hear insects, distant birds, or the low sounds cattle make while moving around, but at that moment the whole pasture seemed quiet. Then I saw the glow. It came from the dip in the field where the cattle were staring. At first it looked like fog catching the first light of dawn, but the glow was too concentrated for that. A pale white haze hovered just above the grass, maybe 4 or 5 feet off the ground. I stepped out of the truck and leaned against the door. The cattle didn't move. Every one of them still faced that glow. The haze brightened slightly, and then it lifted. The glowing patch rose slowly from the grass, bringing the fog-like mist with it. As it climbed, the haze thinned enough that I could see something inside it. A dark oval shape. It hovered about 10 feet above the ground, completely silent. The glow around it dimmed until it was just a faint outline against the early morning sky. I took a few steps forward without really thinking about it. The air felt strange, heavier than normal. My ears popped suddenly, like I'd just driven up a steep hill. At the same moment, the object moved sideways across the pasture. The movement was perfectly smooth, not drifting like a balloon or flying like a helicopter, just sliding through the air in a straight line. The cattle turned their heads as it passed, tracking it. Not one of them made a sound. The object stopped near the center of the field. The faint glow beneath it brightened again. For a moment, I could see the underside clearly, smooth metal with faint circular patterns like rings pressed into the surface. Then it rose, straight up. The cattle flinched slightly, but still didn't scatter. Within seconds, the object climbed above the fence line and continued rising into the sky. The glow faded as it went higher. By the time the sun finally broke the horizon, the object had disappeared completely. The pressure in my ears released. The cattle began moving again almost immediately, lowering their heads and grazing like nothing unusual had happened. I stood there staring at the empty sky for a while before getting back in the truck. When I checked the clock on the dashboard, it read 6:14 a.m. But when I'd pulled over to watch the pasture, it had been just before 5:50. More than 20 minutes had passed, and I could have sworn the whole thing, from the moment the glow rose from the grass to when the object vanished into the sky, had taken less than 3. I was out on the lake before sunrise when it happened. There's a small reservoir about 30 minutes from where I live, and during the summer I like to get there early to fish before the sun gets too high. Most people don't show up until mid-morning, so if you launch early enough, you can have the whole lake to yourself. That morning, it was just me. The air was still, and the water was so calm it looked almost like glass. My little aluminum boat drifted slowly while I worked a line along the edge of some submerged trees. The sky was still dark, but it had that faint gray glow on the horizon that tells you dawn is coming. I remember checking my phone for the time. It was 5:02 a.m. A few minutes later, I heard something. At first, it sounded like a distant humming noise. Not loud, just a low vibration that seemed to sit somewhere between a sound and a feeling. It was hard to tell where it was coming from. Out on open water like that, sound travels strangely. Sometimes you hear a boat from miles away and it seems like it's right next to you. But there weren't any other boats out there. I looked around the lake. Everything was still. The humming grew slightly stronger. It wasn't exactly a noise in my ears. It felt more like a vibration in my chest. Then something caught my eye on the surface of the water. About 30 yards in front of my boat, the water had started glowing. Not bright like a spotlight. More like a faint pale light shining up from underneath the surface. The glow spread slowly in a long, narrow shape beneath the water. It moved in a straight line, completely silent. I stood up in the boat to get a better look. The glowing line passed under the water directly in front of me, maybe 10 feet below the surface. It was perfectly straight, almost like someone had drawn a glowing ruler beneath the lake. The humming vibration in my chest got stronger as it moved closer. The light continued sliding forward beneath the water until it reached the center of the lake. Then it stopped. The glow faded slightly, but I could still see it under the surface. The water above it looked strange, almost like heat waves rising off pavement. Then the lake surface bulged upward, not violently. Just a smooth dome forming in the water like something large was pressing up from below. I remember gripping the side of the boat without realizing it. The dome rose slowly. Then the surface of the lake broke. Water slid off a curved metal shape emerging from below. It was dark and smooth with a dull silver reflection from the faint morning light. The object rose halfway out of the water and stopped. Most of it was still submerged, but the top portion was clearly visible now. A wide rounded shape, almost like the top of a disc. There were no lights on it, no seams that I could see, just smooth metal. The humming vibration became stronger for a few seconds. Then it stopped completely. The object began rising out of the lake. Water streamed off its sides as it lifted higher and higher, completely silent. The surface tension broke and the last of the water fell away from it in sheets. Once it cleared the surface, I could see its full shape. A large disc, easily 30 or 40 feet across. It hovered about 20 feet above the lake for maybe 3 seconds. Then it started moving upward. The motion was incredibly smooth. Within seconds, it was already higher than the tree line surrounding the reservoir. The sky was starting to brighten with early dawn, and the object became a dark silhouette against the pale horizon. Then it accelerated, not with a sudden burst. It just kept rising faster and faster until it became a small dark speck. Then it vanished completely. The lake surface below slowly settled back to normal. The humming was gone. The water around my boat was calm again, like nothing had happened. I sat down and checked my phone again. The time said 5:41 a.m., but the last time I had looked at the clock before seeing the glow in the water, it had been just after 5. I don't remember sitting there for almost 40 minutes. I only remember that long, straight beam of pale light sliding silently beneath the surface of the lake before the water started to rise. I was driving through the desert outside Ely, Nevada, a few years ago. It was one of those long solo drives where the road stretches out for miles with nothing but scrubland and low hills on both sides. I'd been on the road most of the afternoon and evening, heading west after visiting a friend. By the time this happened, it was well after midnight. The highway was empty. I hadn't seen another car in at least 20 minutes. The sky out there was huge. No city lights, just stars everywhere. I remember noticing how clear it was because the Milky Way was visible straight across the sky. I had the window cracked a little and the radio playing quietly. That's when I saw something strange in the road ahead. At first I thought it was just a reflection from my headlights hitting a road sign or something metallic. A faint glint flashed for a split second above the highway, maybe a few hundred feet in front of me. Then it disappeared. I kept driving. A few seconds later, it flashed again. This time it stayed visible a little longer, and I realized it wasn't on the road. It was hanging in the air above it. I slowed down instinctively. The object didn't glow on its own. It only appeared when my headlights hit it at a certain angle, like a piece of polished metal catching the light. As I got closer, I could see the shape better. It looked like a smooth, curved surface suspended maybe 30 or 40 feet above the highway. The shape was dark, almost blending with the sky, but every so often my headlights would reflect off one side of it. The road was completely straight there. No trees, no poles, nothing it could be attached to. Just empty air. I slowed the car to maybe 20 miles an hour. The object stayed perfectly still. No sound, no blinking lights, just a silent shape hovering above the middle of the highway. I remember feeling confused more than scared at first. My brain kept trying to make it into something normal. Maybe a drone, or a weather balloon, or some weird reflection. But the closer I got, the bigger it looked. The underside was smooth and slightly curved, almost like the bottom of a shallow bowl. It was darker than the sky, but the edges caught the light from my headlights in brief flashes. When I was about 100 feet away, something strange happened. The radio in my car went completely silent. No static, no music, just dead quiet. At the same time, I felt a pressure in my ears like when you change altitude quickly. The object moved, not forward or backward, it tilted, just slightly. And I realized it wasn't small, it was huge. The curved underside stretched wider than the road, maybe 40 or 50 feet across. My headlights reflected along the edge as it angled upward, and for a second I could see the whole outline against the stars. A perfect dark disk. Then it started rising, straight up, slowly at first, completely silent. The pressure in my ears got stronger the higher it went. My chest even felt tight for a moment, like the air had gotten heavier. The object climbed above the road, then above the low desert hills nearby. Once it cleared the ridgeline, the movement changed. It didn't accelerate like a plane or rocket. It just kept going faster without any visible effort. Within seconds, it was a small, dark shape against the stars. Then a tiny flash of reflected light, and it was gone. The pressure vanished instantly. My radio suddenly crackled, and the music came back on mid-song. I sat there in the middle of the empty highway with the engine running and the headlights shining down the road where the thing had been hovering. When I finally looked down at the dashboard clock, it read 2:41 a.m. The last time I'd checked the time before seeing the reflection in the road, it had been 2:07. I don't remember sitting there for 30 minutes. I only remember watching that curved metal shape tilt above the highway and drift silently into the desert sky. I was driving home from a late shift at a small hospital outside Cedar Ridge. I worked maintenance there, and sometimes I didn't get out until well after midnight. The drive back to my place took about 40 minutes through farmland and stretches of forest where there weren't many houses. That night, the sky was completely clear. No clouds, just a huge spread of stars. The road was empty too. I hadn't passed another car for almost 15 minutes. I remember because I had the radio off and the quiet was starting to make me sleepy. About halfway home, there's a long, straight section of road that runs between two wide fields. Nothing out there except a few barns way off in the distance. That's where I saw the light. At first, I thought it was a plane coming toward me. A white light was hovering low over the field on the right side of the road. But something about it looked wrong. It wasn't moving, just sitting there. I slowed the truck a little and leaned forward over the steering wheel, trying to figure out what I was looking at. The light wasn't very bright, but it was steady. No blinking like aircraft lights, and it looked low, maybe 50 feet above the ground. I kept driving slowly. The light didn't change at all as I got closer. No sound either. Normally when a plane or helicopter is that low, you hear it before you see it. But the only sound in the truck was the engine and the tires on the pavement. When I got close enough to see the field clearly in my headlights, I realized something else was strange. The grass wasn't moving. There was a steady breeze that night. I could see tree branches along the road swaying a little, but the grass directly under the light looked completely still. I pulled the truck onto the shoulder and stopped. The light stayed where it was. For a few seconds, I just sat there staring across the field. Then the light dimmed slightly, and that's when I noticed the shape around it. The glow had been hiding it before, but now I could make out something darker surrounding the light. A wide shape hanging in the air, smooth, almost perfectly round. It reminded me of a lid hovering upside down. The light was coming from the center of its underside. I stepped out of the truck. The night air felt colder than before. Not freezing, just sharper somehow. The moment my boots hit the gravel, my ears popped. It felt like pressure building inside my head. The object moved, not forward or backward, up. It rose slowly from above the field, keeping the same steady white glow underneath it. The movement was so smooth, it didn't look like flying, more like it was being lifted by something invisible. I stood there watching it climb. The pressure in my ears got stronger. My chest even felt tight for a second. When it reached about the height of the treetops along the road, it stopped, just hovered there. Then the glow under it shifted slightly to one side, almost like it was turning. For a moment, the light pointed directly toward the road, toward me. The field, the fence posts, even the hood of my truck all lit up faintly. But the beam wasn't wide like a spotlight. It was narrow and soft, almost like fog glowing from inside. It lasted maybe 3 seconds. Then the glow faded again. The object tilted slightly, just enough that I could see the edge of it against the stars. And it went straight up. No acceleration, no sound. 1 second it was just above the tree line. The next it was already high enough that it looked like a small white dot. Then it vanished, just gone. The pressure in my ears released immediately. The breeze moved through the field again and the grass started swaying like normal. I stood there for a while staring at the empty sky before getting back in the truck. When I looked at the clock on the dashboard, it said 1:52 a.m. But I clearly remembered leaving the hospital parking lot at 1:05. Even with the slow driving, the trip to that stretch of road shouldn't have taken more than 20 minutes. Somehow, almost 45 minutes had passed. And I have no memory of the drive between the hospital and that empty road where I stopped. I woke up with my phone already in my hand, which was weird enough on its own. I usually kept it on the nightstand, and I'm not the type to scroll myself to sleep. But what really unsettled me was that the phone was warm, like it had been running something heavy. Not hot, just noticeably warmer than anything should have been at 6 in the morning. The screen was unlocked, bright, and the last open app was the camera, not the gallery, not a selfie accidentally triggered. Just the camera interface, pointed at nothing, like I'd been holding it up while I slept. For a few seconds, I just lay there staring at it, trying to figure out if I'd rolled onto the phone somehow and opened it by accident. But my hand was wrapped around it too neatly, like I'd fallen asleep holding it. I never do that. I tapped over to the gallery. No new photos, no videos. Just the usual stuff. Receipts I'd snapped, a picture of my niece's drawing, nothing strange. The camera app sitting open with no evidence of use gave me this weird feeling, like I'd missed something that had happened right in front of me. I set the phone down and sat up. The air in the room felt slightly stuffy, like the heat had been running too long. The first thing I did was go check the thermostat in the hallway. It read 66, which was normal, but the air felt warmer than that, warmer near my bedroom door especially. I chalked it up to just waking up groggy. I got ready for work, made coffee, tried not to think too much about the phone thing. Still, the thought wormed its way back every few minutes. At lunch, I finally checked the phone's battery logs just out of curiosity. Around 3:12 a.m., something had spiked the battery drain for about 5 minutes. Not dramatically, but enough that it dropped a few percentage points in a short window. The phone had been awake, screen on. The camera was listed as active. I stared at that timestamp for a while. I had no memory of waking up at all. No dreams, no interruptions. Just a gap between falling asleep and waking with the phone in my hand. That night, I plugged the phone in on the far side of the nightstand, not just dropped loosely next to the bed. I wanted to be sure I couldn't reach it without consciously doing so. I even angled its screen down. I fell asleep watching the streetlight glow through the blinds. Around 2 a.m., I woke up for no clear reason. No sound, no dream. Just a sudden alertness, like someone had stepped into the room. My heart was already beating faster than it should have been for just waking up. The room was dim, the blinds shaping faint bars of light across the dresser. I reached for my glasses and paused because I realized something was different. The air wasn't still. It felt pressed, like the whole room had a slight inward pull to it, the kind of pressure shift you get before a weather front hits, but more focused. My ears had that muted fullness, and when I swallowed, it only half cleared. I turned toward the nightstand. The phone was sitting upright. I had absolutely not propped it like that. It wasn't leaning on anything, just balanced, screen facing the room like someone had set it there carefully. I froze, staring at it. The screen was black, but I could see a faint glow around the edges, the kind you get when the display is technically on, but showing a full black image. I reached out slowly and tapped the screen. The camera app was open again. I dropped my hand back into my lap and just sat there breathing through my nose, trying to stay calm. The phone log from earlier that day flashed through my mind, the timestamp, the spike, the camera being active. I didn't touch the phone again. I just watched it, expecting something to move, some reflection to shift, but the room stayed still. After a long minute, the screen dimmed to black again. I lay down without turning my back to it. Eventually, I fell asleep, but it was that shallow kind of sleep where you're half aware of your body and half dreaming. Every time I shifted, I checked for the glow of the screen. It didn't turn on again. The next morning, nothing looked out of place. The phone was lying flat now, like it normally would be. But the battery log showed the same thing. Around 2:08 a.m., the phone had woken and stayed active for almost 2 minutes. Camera app, no photos saved, nothing in the recent files. I tried to tell myself I must have done something in my sleep, even though I knew that explanation didn't fit. I'd placed the phone way out of reach on purpose. It wasn't even where I'd left it. That evening, when I got home from work, I decided to check the living room camera. I have one of those small security cams that points at the hallway intersection. Bedroom on the right, bathroom ahead, living room to the left. I scrubbed through the footage around the time I'd woken the night before. At 2:07 a.m., the hallway lights up slightly. Not much, not enough to look like a lamp turning on. More like the light temperature shifts, cooler, then warmer, then normal again. The camera tries to adjust exposure for 2 frames, then it steadies. Nothing moves, but for exactly 1 second, the timestamp flickers backward, not forward, backward, by only a fraction, but it was obvious, a tiny shake in the countdown. I replayed it 5 times. Same thing. A weird glitch, but only for that one window. That night, I put the phone in the living room before going to bed. On the coffee table, screen facing down. I didn't want it near me. I didn't even plug it in, just left it alone. I fell asleep surprisingly fast. When I woke up, the phone was back on the nightstand. Screen up, unlocked, camera open. I sat there staring at it for a long time. My hand hadn't touched the phone. I checked my hallway camera footage immediately. At 4:03 a.m., the camera caught me walking down the hall, except I had no memory of walking anywhere. There I was, moving calmly, almost too calmly, straight toward the living room. The footage was slightly grainy, but I could see my posture was stiff, like my arms didn't swing naturally. I reached the coffee table, leaned forward, and picked up the phone. Then the footage glitched, just a single skipped frame, and suddenly I was standing still, facing the hallway. Then I turned and walked back toward my room. In the video, the whole thing lasted maybe 8 seconds. In reality, I had no memory of any of it. The phone's battery log showed activity during that same window. Camera app, again, but still no photos, no videos, nothing recorded. The strangest part? The hallway camera didn't trigger motion alerts during the clip. It only saved the video because I manually pulled the timestamp. It hadn't recognized me moving. I don't know what to make of any of it. I started sleeping with the phone powered off, battery drained completely. But twice now I've woken up to it lying beside me, warm, charged a few percent somehow. Camera app open to a black screen. Whatever is happening, it feels less like something is watching me and more like something is looking through the phone. And every morning the phone is a little warmer than it should be, as if it's been used for something I never see. I was driving back from a work trip in southern Colorado, taking Highway 50 instead of the interstate because I wanted a quieter route. It was close to 10 p.m., the kind of cold, dry night where the air feels thin and the stars look sharper than usual. The road cut through long stretches of open land, low brush, rolling hills, no houses for miles. My high beams were on, mostly out of habit. Traffic was practically non-existent. About halfway between Fowler and Rocky Ford, there's a stretch where the road straightens out for a long time. I'd driven it before, but never that late and never alone. I remember glancing at the clock, 9:58, then leaning back and trying to relax my shoulders. I'd been driving for hours. Maybe 2 minutes later, I saw the shape. It happened so fast and so quietly that I almost doubted I'd seen anything at all. My headlights swept across something above the road, smooth, dark, motionless. At first I thought it was a low branch or a blown-over sign, but there was no tree line, no poles, nothing that should have been hanging there. It wasn't a shadow. My headlights hit it, reflected off it, but only faintly, like it absorbed most of the light. I eased off the accelerator instantly. The shape wasn't large enough to be a helicopter or anything mechanical I recognized. It was maybe the width of a car, but flatter, like a curved sheet of metal or stone suspended 10 feet off the ground. No wings, no cables, no movement. I rolled closer, maybe another 40 feet, my brakes lightly engaged without me thinking about it. The shape didn't sway or shift. It was motionless and perfectly centered over the road, as if someone had measured the spot down to the inch. The road around me was silent. No insects, no wind, just the hum of my engine. I slowed to almost a crawl. My headlights lit the underside of the shape again, smooth, featureless, no texture or ridges. The light didn't glint off it the way it would a street sign. Instead, it reflected in a soft, muted way, like shining a flashlight at wet asphalt. I remember gripping the steering wheel tighter and leaning forward, as if getting closer to the windshield would help make sense of it. For a second, I thought it was simply hovering there. Then it lifted. Not diagonally, not drifting like a balloon. It rose straight up, smooth, steady, almost delicate. No acceleration, no wobbling, no sound. Just a clean vertical movement so precise it felt unnatural. I watched it rise maybe 20 or 30 feet. Then it sped up. Not a burst of speed, but a gradual increase, like someone turning up a dial. Within a couple seconds, it faded into the dark sky. Not disappeared, faded. The higher it went, the harder it was to distinguish its dark surface from the surrounding night, until it blended completely. I pulled the car to a full stop in the middle of the road without realizing it. My heart wasn't racing. It was slow, heavy, like my body didn't know how to react. I rolled the window down and listened. Nothing. The road stretched ahead, empty and pale in my headlights. The landscape around me didn't move. Even the usual distant hum of nighttime air seemed muted. After a minute, I stepped out of the car. The cold hit me immediately, but I barely felt it. I looked straight up, scanning for any sign of the shape. The stars were bright and none were obscured. Nothing moved overhead. The silence felt thick, like sound could get lost in it. I stood there maybe 30 seconds before the cold finally broke through the numbness, and I got back into the car. I kept expecting the dome light to flicker or the engine to stall, something to match the weirdness, but everything behaved normally. I drove slowly at first, glancing in the rearview mirror more than usual. The landscape behind me looked the same as ever, but the darkness felt heavier. About a mile down the road, I realized something I hadn't noticed earlier. The radio display was frozen. The backlight was on, but the numbers weren't moving. No station name, no clock, no audio. I tapped the power button. Nothing. I held it down. Nothing. I switched to my phone, but the signal indicator was blank. Not low. Blank. Like the phone wasn't even trying to find a connection. I drove another 5 or 6 minutes before the radio suddenly came back to life mid-sentence, the way radios do after you start the car. My phone buzzed a moment later with a burst of notifications all at once. I pulled over again. I checked the clock on the dashboard. It said 10:04, my phone said 10:01. The difference wasn't huge, but I knew the dashboard clock had been accurate earlier. I'd set it that same morning. Something didn't match. I reset the time on the dashboard and kept driving. When I got home at around 11:40, the first thing I did was look under my car, as if I'd find something attached there. Nothing, just dust and gravel from the road. I even checked the hood and roof. Everything was normal, but I couldn't let go of the image of that shape hanging above the pavement, utterly still until it lifted, rising in a straight, impossible line like gravity wasn't a factor. I thought maybe I dreamed it or exaggerated it in my head, but when I went out the next morning to grab something from the car, something caught my eye. On the hood, near the windshield, was a faint patch of dust cleared away in a nearly perfect oval. Not a handprint, not an animal mark, just a clean, smooth shape where the surface looked slightly less dirty than the rest. I touched it. The metal felt normal, not warm or scorched. I brushed the area with my sleeve, and the boundary between the dusty and clean parts smeared instantly. By noon, it was gone completely, like it had never been there. But I still think about the moment the headlights caught that hanging shape. Dark, silent, suspended over an empty stretch of road, and how it lifted as if the air itself had pulled it upward. I was halfway through my pre-dawn commute when it happened. I work at a small print shop on the edge of town, and sometimes I take the long back road just to avoid the early traffic. That morning was cold enough that the windshield fogged around the edges, but the sky was clear. No wind, no clouds, just that deep blue-black color right before sunrise. I'd been driving for maybe 10 minutes when I noticed something wrong with the horizon. It wasn't brightening the way it normally does. Sunrise usually spreads soft and wide, coloring the whole skyline at once. But this was different. A single narrow strip of light, no wider than a few houses, was glowing straight upward from the horizon like someone had sliced open the sky with a thin blade. It wasn't orange or pink. It was a pale, almost white light, too cold-looking to be morning sun. My first thought was that it was some kind of distant spotlight, maybe a construction site or a work crew setting up early. But the beam didn't move. It didn't fan out. It didn't flicker. It just stood there, perfectly vertical, as if the world was waking up in only one direction. I slowed down without thinking. The tires hummed on the empty road. Trees on both sides were shadowed silhouettes, and that narrow, bright strip sat exactly in the center of the windshield, like it was waiting for me. Something felt off in my chest, this tightness, not painful, just alert. The brightness grew stronger, but still only in that one strip. The rest of the horizon stayed dark. The contrast made it uncomfortable to look at. My eyes kept trying to adjust and failing, switching between too dim and too bright. I pulled over on the gravel shoulder, turned off the headlights, and just watched. The vertical light didn't spread sideways at all. It didn't even glow onto the surroundings the way dawn should. It was self-contained, like a column. After a few seconds, I realized it wasn't even illuminating the clouds, because there were no clouds. The sky above it looked perfectly normal. Then the strip began to retract. Not fade. Retract. The bottom edge lifted upward, slowly at first, then faster, like the light was being pulled back into the sky. The column shortened in reverse, climbing up toward a single point somewhere above the horizon. My hands tightened on the steering wheel, even though the car wasn't moving. The light kept rising until it stopped suddenly, suspended in the air, maybe a couple finger widths above the hills. For a moment it hung there, just a concentrated vertical dash of white in the middle of nowhere. Then it snapped out. No gradual dimming, no bleed into the sky. It simply vanished, leaving the horizon dark again. Everything felt too quiet, not peaceful, empty. Even the engine ticking as it cooled sounded distant. I rolled down the window and the cold air hit me in a strange, hollow way, like it wasn't carrying any scents or sounds. No birds, no distant traffic, no wind in the trees. I checked the time on the dashboard, 6:07 a.m. Sunrise should have been half an hour away, but the sky looked darker than usual for that time. I sat there for maybe a full minute, listening, waiting to see if it returned. Nothing did. Eventually, I turned the car back on and kept driving, though my hands were unsteady on the wheel. A few miles down, something else caught my attention. The fields on either side of the road were frosted lightly, which wasn't strange. It had been cold enough. But the frost near the road had melted in a perfect rectangle, like a giant warm panel had hovered over the grass and thawed only that patch. Maybe 30 feet long, 10 feet wide. I slowed to look at it, half expecting to see tire tracks or footprints, but the mud was untouched. The thawed area was smooth, almost glossy with moisture. When I got to work, I mentioned the weird sunrise strip to my coworker, Angela, just to see if she'd noticed anything on her drive. She didn't. She said the morning looked normal to her. No strange brightness, no column of light. She asked if maybe I'd passed through a patch of fog. There'd been no fog. All morning I kept checking the time, like the clocks were slightly off. They weren't, but it felt like I'd started the day earlier than I should have. The sky outside the shop windows brightened normally, spreading across the whole horizon in a gradual, familiar gradient. Nothing like what I'd seen on that back road. When my shift ended, I drove back the same way, half dreading it, half hoping for some kind of explanation. In the daylight, the thawed rectangle was still visible, now just a damp patch of flattened grass. The rest of the field was crisp with frost. I stopped again, stepped out, and walked to the edge of the patch. The air there felt slightly warmer. Not warm, just less biting. The temperature difference was small, but noticeable. When I crouched and pressed my hand to the grass, it felt damp but not cold enough to sting. I stayed there only a few seconds. The silence of the field pressed in too much. That night, lying in bed, I kept replaying the way the light had retracted. So clean, so exact, like something pulling a cord straight upward. I told myself it must have been an atmospheric thing, some weird trick of distant lights or inversion layers. But dawn doesn't behave like that. Light doesn't behave like that. And the way the glow disappeared, like it had been taken, not extinguished, stuck with me. It felt less like something had risen and more like something had closed. I was down in Utility Tunnel 3 just after midnight, lying on my stomach with half my upper body shoved into an access panel when I felt the vibration for the first time. It wasn't strong, just a low, steady tremor running through the concrete floor. At first, I thought it was a generator cycling up somewhere else in the network. That happened sometimes when power got rerouted during night tests. But this vibration didn't pulse. It didn't fade. It just stayed. A constant, even hum under my elbows and ribs. I'd been sent down there because a set of fiber lines in Section 3B kept dropping signal. Nothing exotic, just routine maintenance. Replace the connectors, reseal the junction box, run a diagnostic, call it good. The tunnels were quiet at night, which usually made the job easier. No foot traffic, no carts buzzing past, no pressure to hurry. But that night the air tasted like dust and metal, dry enough to sting my throat. I slid out of the panel and sat up. The vibration was stronger when I placed my palms flat on the floor. Not shaking, just humming, like some huge machine was running below me. Except nothing was supposed to be under Section 3B. The schematics for that part of the base were simple. Tunnel, conduit lines, emergency lights. Empty earth beneath it. I checked the wall to make sure it wasn't the conduits rattling. Everything was still. No loose clamps, no airflow. The whole tunnel was silent except for that faint hum coming through the concrete. I followed it a few steps. It didn't change. It didn't get louder or quieter. It was like the entire slab was the speaker for whatever was below. I pulled out my radio and called up to my supervisor, Mark. "You guys running any heavy equipment tonight?" I asked. "No." "Why?" he said. "Just checking. I'm getting some vibration down here." "From where?" "Everywhere. Hard to pin down." He paused. "Probably power cycling. We've had weird drain spikes." "Doesn't feel like power," I said. "Well, nothing's running in that sector. You okay to finish the job?" "Yeah," I said, even though I wasn't sure. I got back on my knees and reached into the panel again. The vibration made my tools buzz against the floor. I tightened a coupling and checked the line integrity. Everything looked normal. The cables didn't seem affected, but my hands wouldn't stop trembling, and I couldn't tell if it was the vibration or nerves. I kept working, trying to ignore the feeling that something much larger than me was moving somewhere far below, slow and deliberate. I'd heard stories from guys who'd worked other bases, rumors about underground testing floors, hidden elevators, all kinds of nonsense, but this wasn't like anything they described. This wasn't machinery starting and stopping. This was continuous, steady pressure. About 20 minutes later, the vibration changed pitch. Barely noticeable, but enough that I froze with one hand still buried in the wiring. The hum dipped lower, like whatever was below had shifted gears. I leaned forward and pressed my ear to the concrete. It felt almost warm against my skin. That wasn't possible. The tunnels stayed cold year-round. I jerked back and wiped the sweat from my forehead. The air felt tighter suddenly, like the tunnel was holding its breath. I stood up and took a few steps, trying to see if the vibration changed with distance. It didn't. No matter where I walked, the hum stayed exactly the same. Not louder, not softer, not directional, just present. I checked my watch. Almost 1 a.m. I wanted to be done, but when I turned back to the open panel, the lights overhead flickered once. Just once, barely a blink, but enough to make the tunnel look darker than it should have. I tightened the last connector, closed up the junction box, and ran a diagnostic on my handheld. The reading came back clean. Signal restored. Everything normal, except nothing felt normal. I started packing up my tools when the hum suddenly dipped again, deeper than before. This time, I felt it in my teeth. I swallowed hard and backed away from the wall. That's when I heard footsteps coming down the tunnel, just soft ones at first, then louder as Mark came into view, holding a flashlight even though the overhead lights were working. "You good down here?" he asked. "Yeah," I said, "just finishing up." He stepped into the section with me. The hum stopped, not gradually, not fading. It cut out instantly, like someone flipped a switch. Mark didn't react at all. He crouched next to the panel and checked the seal. "Looks fine," he said. "You fixed the drop?" "Yeah," he nodded and stood again. "Then you're done. Let's get upstairs." I didn't move at first. I was waiting for the vibration to come back, or for him to mention it, or for anything to acknowledge what had been happening. But the tunnel was silent. Just the faint buzz of the overhead lights and the sound of our breathing. "You don't hear that?" I asked. "Hear what?" "The vibration from earlier." Mark sighed like he didn't want to have the conversation. "Power cycling. Happens all the time." This wasn't power. "There's nothing under this section," he said, not meeting my eye. "You've seen the schematics." I know what I felt. "Long night," he said. "Let's go." He walked back toward the access ladder. I followed, but slowly. Halfway up, I glanced back into the tunnel. It looked empty. Normal. Boring, even. But something about the concrete floor still bothered me. I couldn't shake the memory of that warmth against my ear. When we reached the surface level, I checked the system logs. No anomalies, no power fluctuations, no alerts. The timestamp for the moment the lights flickered wasn't even listed. I asked Mark if he saw anything weird in the logs earlier. "Nope," he said. "Everything's green." He shut the folder and gave me this tight smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Get some rest. You're overthinking it." I didn't argue. I clocked out, drove home, and lay awake for hours replaying the sensation in my head. The schematic said there was nothing underneath that tunnel. The logs said nothing happened. Mark said it was power cycling, but I knew what the concrete felt like. Steady, rhythmic, alive with something moving deep below where anything officially existed. And I knew it stopped the exact second he walked in. We were camped maybe 3 miles from the outer boundary fence, at one of those unofficial pull-off spots people use when they don't want to pay for a campground. It was early fall, desert nights already getting cold. There were 4 of us, me, my friend Lucas, and a couple we'd met earlier that day, Maria and her brother Jonah. We weren't doing anything wild, just grilled some food, had a couple beers, and sat around talking until we all started getting tired. I went into my tent around midnight. The others stayed up a bit longer, but by 1:30 the whole camp was quiet. The air smelled like dust and the leftover smoke from the little fire we'd put out. The sky was clear, really clear, the way it only gets out in that part of Nevada. You could see every star. I must have been asleep for 30, maybe 40 minutes when I felt the ground vibrate. Not a jolt, not shaking, more like a long, steady hum, almost like a big truck idling underground. It wasn't loud. It was subtle enough that I thought it might be part of my dream at first. But when I opened my eyes, the tent fabric was trembling just slightly, like someone was running a hand across it from the outside. Then, almost at the exact same second, all 3 car alarms went off. Mine, Lucas's, and the rental Jonah had brought. They didn't go into full alarm, more like a single chirp, the kind that usually means the doors were locked or unlocked remotely, except nobody had touched anything. I sat up fast. I heard the zipper of another tent, then Jonah whispering, "Did you guys feel that?" Lucas answered, "Yeah, something's vibrating." The ground gave another pulse, not stronger, just more definite, like it was making sure we noticed this time. I stepped out into the cold and saw the others doing the same. The air felt still, too still for the desert at night. No wind, no insects, no distant highway noise. All 3 cars had their parking lights flicker once before shutting off again. "Could be a quake," Maria said, but she didn't sound convinced. There was no follow-up tremor, no shifting dirt, nothing that felt like natural movement. We all looked toward the fence line, even though it was too far away to see from where we were. Mostly, I think we wanted to make sure nothing was coming. When I tilted my head back, I noticed something in the sky. It wasn't a light, exactly. More like a dim circular glow way higher than anything should have been glowing. Not bright enough to illuminate anything on the ground, but bright enough to look wrong. A vague, uneven ring, like the afterimage you get from staring at a flashlight, except it stayed perfectly still. "Is that a cloud?" Lucas asked. "There aren't any clouds," I said. He was right about the shape. It looked like a cloud lit from behind. But the sky was empty. Stars everywhere except inside that faint circle. Inside it, the stars were muted, not gone, but dimmer somehow. We stood there watching it, nobody saying anything for a long time. The ground vibration continued at this slow, constant frequency. Not painful, not even uncomfortable, just this low humming that made my teeth feel like they wanted to buzz. Then it stopped, completely. The silence afterward felt heavier, like the air was waiting for something. The circle of light flickered once. It didn't brighten or dim, it just pulsed, like someone tapping a light switch too quickly to fully shut it off. Then it stayed steady again, hovering above us without moving. Jonah muttered, "What the hell is that?" None of us answered. We didn't have anything to compare it to. It wasn't a plane, it wasn't a drone, it wasn't a spotlight. There were no beams, no sound, no movement. After maybe another minute, the circle began fading, not shrinking, just losing brightness, like someone slowly lowered the exposure on a camera. The stars inside it came back into focus. The edges dissolved into the rest of the sky. Then it was gone, like it had never been there. We kept standing outside, trying to see if it would come back. It didn't. Everything stayed silent. Even the cars stayed quiet. Eventually, Lucas said he was going back to bed. Nobody argued. We were too tired and too unsure what else to do. But none of us slept well after that. I woke up 2 more times during the night, checking the sky through the mesh of my tent. Nothing. Just stars. When the sun came up, we walked around the camp looking for anything unusual. No footprints that weren't ours. No disturbed dirt. No marks on the cars. Nothing that would explain why all 3 alarms chirped at once. Before we packed up, I checked the car's diagnostic display. It showed a brief voltage spike at 2:04 a.m., the exact moment everything happened. Lucas's car had the same spike. The rental didn't have detailed diagnostics, but Jonah said the clock had reset itself to midnight. We talked about reporting it to someone, but Who do you even call for something like that? It wasn't a crash. It wasn't a fire. It wasn't anything you could describe without sounding like you were making it up. When we drove off, I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting the circle to reappear. It didn't. Everything looked normal in daylight. The same desert scrub, same empty sky, but I kept replaying the moment the ground stopped vibrating, that sudden stillness right before the glow faded. It felt almost like whatever caused it had moved on, and we were standing in the absence it left behind. We didn't camp that close to the boundary again. They brought me in as a civilian consultant for a propulsion project, though project was the only word anyone ever used. No formal title, no description, just a budget code and a schedule of when I needed to show up. I'd been doing materials analysis for defense contractors for years, so none of that was unusual. What was unusual was how the escort who picked me up didn't make small talk during the drive, not even the standard hot one today stuff. He just handed me a visitor badge with no department listed and said, "Follow me, don't deviate." The building they walked me into looked like every other research facility in the Southwest. Tan concrete, tinted windows, humming air conditioners, but the interior was colder than any lab I'd worked in, and quieter. Even the ventilation seemed muted. A man named Dr. A. Rourke greeted me in a windowless room that could have passed for a storage closet if not for the stainless steel table in the center. He had the look of someone who hadn't slept well in weeks. Pale, flat affect, eyes slightly unfocused. He didn't shake my hand, just nodded and said, "We'd like your assessment of a sample." That was it. He opened a slim metal case and slid it toward me. Inside was a small alloy fragment, maybe the size of a matchbox. Dull silver gray, no markings. It looked unremarkable at first glance, but when I picked it up, I froze. It weighed almost nothing, not light for its size, but wrong, like holding a piece of rigid foam, except the metal was cool and perfectly solid. I pressed a fingernail into it. Nothing. No give. "What is this made of?" I asked. "That's what we want you to tell us," Rourke said. I tested flexing it between my fingers. Steel shouldn't bend that way. This didn't bend at all. It didn't resist. It simply didn't register pressure the same way, like it redistributed force across its structure instantly. "Do you have spectral data?" I asked. He shook his head. "We'd prefer you make observations before we share anything." That phrasing stuck with me. I took it to the portable analyzer they'd set up in the room. Nothing fancy, just a baseline mass spectrometer. I ran a quick surface scan. The output came back almost clean. Too clean. Like the system couldn't get a reading deeper than a few microns. The results showed trace elements similar to titanium alloys, but the distribution pattern made no sense. "This surface density," I started. "We know," he said. I tried heating it with a low-temperature torch, something I've done with hundreds of unknown samples. Normally you'd see minor discoloration or at least surface oxidation. Nothing happened. The temperature probe didn't even show the surface warming in the spot I applied heat. That made my stomach tighten. "Where did you get this?" I asked. Rourke's expression didn't change. I waited for clarification. He didn't give any. "You mean it wasn't manufactured on site?" "No," he said quietly. "It wasn't built here." The way he emphasized that word, "here," made the air feel colder. Before I could ask more, another technician entered the room and whispered in Rourke's ear. He nodded. "I'll need the sample back now," he said. I hesitated. "I haven't finished my analysis." "That's fine," he said. "We have what we need." I set it in his hand. Even he seemed to grip it lighter than necessary, like he didn't trust the weight. He closed the case and gave me a thin smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Thank you for your time. Your notes will be reviewed." That was it. No follow-up questions. No explanation. They escorted me back outside within 10 minutes. The sun felt harsh after the fluorescent quiet of the room. That night, curiosity got the better of me. I reviewed the surface scan on my personal laptop. Not the data files, just the handwritten notes I'd taken. The numbers didn't look real. Density and mass didn't align with any known structural material. It was too strong, too light, too stable. And the way it resisted the heat, if I had recorded that with real calibration equipment, it would have been groundbreaking. I tried to remember if there were any distinctive marks on the fragment, but all I could picture was this perfect, uniform structure. No machining, no welds, no grain. as if it had never been shaped by any tool. 2 days later, they called me back. Same escort, same badge, same room, but the stainless steel table was empty this time. Rourke entered holding a clipboard. "Thank you for your cooperation," he said. "Your consultation is complete." "No further analysis?" I asked. He shook his head. "The sample is no longer available." I waited for him to elaborate. He didn't. On my way out, I passed the technician who'd whispered to him earlier in the week. He avoided eye contact. His posture was stiff, like someone bracing themselves. When I reached my car, I realized something strange. The original visitor badge, the one from 2 days earlier, wasn't in my bag or my pocket. I always kept badges until they collected them, but that one had vanished. That night, while reviewing my notes again, I noticed a line I didn't remember writing. Under the density observation, in different handwriting than mine, neater, almost printed, was a single word, reclassified. I stared at it for a long time. I had no memory of writing it. I had no memory of anyone else touching my notebook. Nothing else on the page was altered. I wanted desperately to believe it was a trick, a fatigue, or that I'd written it absent-mindedly. But the handwriting didn't match mine. I closed the notebook and didn't open it again for weeks. Even now, the part that unsettles me most isn't the alloy itself. It's how quickly they took it back, how abruptly the conversation ended the moment it drifted toward origin, and the way Rourke said it wasn't built here with absolute certainty. I was sitting behind my house in Grand Junction, just trying to cool off from the heat that had hung around all day. It was close to 10:30 p.m., one of those late summer nights where the air finally stops feeling heavy after sundown. I dragged an old folding chair out to the patch of gravel behind the garage, mostly because the house felt stuffy and I didn't feel like running the AC. The sky was mostly clear, except for a few long, thin clouds drifting west. I wasn't out there for any reason, just needed fresh air, needed space from screens, needed something quiet. I didn't even turn on the porch light. I just sat in the dark with a bottle of water, listening to the distant hum of the highway. A couple minutes in, my ears suddenly popped. Not like when you go up a mountain or fly. This was sharper, like a quick pressure change just behind the eardrums. It made me jolt upright. Both ears at the same time, like a snap from inside my head. The air hadn't shifted. No breeze, no temperature change, nothing to explain it. I waited for a second pop, thinking maybe I'd swallowed weird or moved wrong, but nothing followed. The quiet seemed deeper, though. The distant traffic felt muted. The cicadas that had been buzzing earlier were silent. I tilted my head, testing my hearing. Everything sounded normal enough, but underneath it all there was this faint, low hum. Not from the highway, not electrical, more like the kind of vibration you feel rather than hear. That was when I noticed the light. It was small, really small, like a distant star, except it wasn't where any star should have been. This was lower, maybe a little above the cloud line. A single point of pale white light drifting horizontally across the gap between two thin clouds, slow and steady. Too slow for a plane, but too smooth for anything drifting like a balloon or lantern. At first I thought it might just be a star peeking through a moving cloud, but the clouds weren't moving that fast and the light wasn't holding its position. It was deliberately moving, like it had somewhere to go. I watched it glide for maybe 10 seconds. No blinking, no change in size. Just a steady glide, almost hypnotic. Then the pressure in my ears shifted again. Another subtle pop, softer this time. The hum beneath everything deepened for a moment. The point of light dipped. Not much, just a tiny drop, maybe a couple degrees downward, but enough to prove it wasn't something fixed in the distance. Then it angled up slowly, almost like it was correcting itself. I stood up without realizing I'd done it. My legs felt unsteady, not from fear exactly, but from that weird instinct you get when something breaks the pattern of the world. I stepped forward into the yard, gravel crunching under my shoes. The light drifted behind a thin cloud, dimming a little but not disappearing. I kept my eyes trained on it, waiting for it to blink like a plane would. It didn't. When it emerged from the other side, it paused. I swear, it paused. It hung in place without drifting for maybe 2 full seconds, like it was thinking or observing or recalibrating. The hum in the air got slightly stronger during that pause. just enough to make my chest feel tight. Then the light moved again, but this time vertically. Straight up, smooth as before. Nothing accelerated, nothing changed brightness. It just climbed, slow and deliberate. As it rose, the pressure in my ears faded. The hum eased up too. The light kept climbing until it reached a part of the sky where the stars were brighter. Then it stopped again. For a moment it blended in too well. I thought I'd lost it. The sky was scattering with stars, and the point looked almost identical to the others. I was about to give up when it shifted to the left just a hair, enough to catch my attention again. It held there for a long moment. I had no clue what I was looking at. My brain kept trying to label it. Satellite, airplane, drone, but none of those moved like this. I must have stood there for a full minute watching the tiny point hover, waiting for anything else to happen. Then it dimmed, not like it was getting farther, but like someone was turning down a dial. A soft fade, no flicker. It faded until it matched the brightness of the dimmest stars. Then it faded more, then it vanished. The moment it disappeared, my ears popped one last time. Pressure releasing, like the atmosphere around me had been slightly distorted and suddenly corrected itself. The cicadas started up again, just like that. The hum underneath everything vanished too. The night returned to normal in this abrupt, casual way that made everything feel even stranger. I stayed outside another 20 minutes, scanning the sky, telling myself it had to be something ordinary. A trick of perspective, a weird plane, a satellite doing something unusual. Anything. Nothing else showed up. The sky looked exactly the same as any other night. When I finally went inside, my phone charging on the kitchen counter had switched its time for some reason. It showed 10:52, even though I was sure I'd come outside at 10:30. The clock on the stove still said 10:37. I thought maybe the phone had reset itself or lost signal, but the Wi-Fi was fine and there were no notifications about any restart. I didn't sleep well that night. Not because of fear exactly, more because of the feeling that something had moved through the sky. Something close enough to affect the air around me, and I had seen only one small point of it. The next evening, I went back outside at the same time, hoping I'd see something again just to make it feel explainable. Nothing happened. Clear sky, normal sounds, normal everything. But the memory of that subtle hum stayed with me, especially because of the way it stopped the instant the light vanished. Like whatever that point was, it hadn't just been drifting, it had been here, and then it left. I was camping alone in the Bitterroot Range, not far from an old trailhead my uncle used to take me to when I was a kid. I picked a small clearing near a creek, flat enough for my tent, far enough from the water that I wouldn't wake up freezing. It was late September, cool but not cold, and the air smelled like pine sap and damp dirt. I'd gotten there late in the afternoon and spent most of the daylight setting up camp and collecting deadfall for the fire. By the time I finished eating, the sun had dropped behind the ridge. The sky was still light, but the forest itself had already turned dark, that kind of soft, shadowy darkness where everything looks like it's holding its breath. I remember poking at the fire with a stick, listening to the usual forest sounds, crickets, the creek, occasional rustling from small animals. Then it all stopped. Not gradually, not fading, everything just ceased. The creek still ran, but even that seemed quieter somehow, like someone had put a wall between me and the sound. I lifted my head, waiting for the insects to start up again, but the silence stayed thick and absolute. Even the wind, which had been moving the branches overhead a few seconds earlier, was suddenly gone. I sat perfectly still, the stick hovering above the fire. I didn't want to make a sound. I didn't want whatever caused that silence to notice me. After maybe 30 seconds, I'm guessing it felt both short and long, I heard a soft, short snap of a twig from deeper in the trees. Not close, not far, not far. Just enough to make my pulse jump. I told myself it was a deer or a raccoon or something normal, but the silence made it impossible to believe that. Forest noise cuts out sometimes when predators are nearby, sure, but this felt different, too complete, too controlled. I stood slowly and took a step back from the fire, back closer to my tent. The air felt heavier, like it was pressing in on my ears. I rubbed one of them without thinking. It didn't pop. It didn't relieve anything. Then I saw it. Between two large trees, maybe 20 yards away, something shimmered in the air. At first, I thought it was heat distortion, like the wavy look above asphalt in the summer. But the night air was cold enough that I'd been seeing my own breath moments before. The shimmer wasn't rising or drifting. It just hung there in a vertical patch, maybe 4 feet wide and 6 feet tall. I leaned slightly to the right. The shimmer shifted with me, not like it was reacting, more like it was layered over the trees, adjusting so that it always stayed directly in my line of sight. If I had taken one more step, I swear it would have still been centered between those two trees. I whispered, "No," without realizing it. The shimmer brightened, only a little, but enough to outline the shape more clearly. It wasn't a shape, exactly. More like a window made of distorted air. A cutout where the forest behind it didn't match the rest of what I was seeing. The background was wrong. Out of focus, but not blurred. Just wrong. I blinked hard. The shimmer pulsed once. Not light, not color. Just a change, like a ripple passing through a thin sheet. The forest stayed silent. I reached for my flashlight, which was clipped to the tent zipper. My fingers brushed it, but something in me refused to actually grab it. I was afraid of what would happen if I pointed a beam at the shimmer, afraid it would respond. Another twig snapped, this one closer, behind the shimmer. I couldn't see anything moving there, but I heard it clearly. Not gradual footsteps, just one deliberate crack of something stepping down. The shimmer flickered, then dissolved, not faded, not moved. It just broke apart like dust being scattered into nothing. The space between the trees returned to normal instantly. The forest sounds didn't return right away. I waited 5, maybe 10 seconds before I heard a single cricket start up again, then another. Then the creak grew louder, like someone slowly turning up a volume knob. When the wind came back, it rustled the branches hard enough that I flinched. Everything went back to normal. I stood there staring at the empty spot between the trees for a long time. I wanted to believe the whole thing was a trick of my eyes, some kind of optical illusion from the firelight, but the silence hadn't been an illusion, and the distortion had reacted when I moved. I finally forced myself to sit back down by the fire. I didn't add more wood. I didn't eat anything else. I just sat there, listening, trying to figure out if I should pack up and hike out in the dark. The trail was narrow and rocky, and I didn't trust myself not to twist an ankle in the panic that would definitely hit once I left the circle of firelight. After maybe 20 minutes, the forest felt normal again. Too normal. Every sound made me jump. The snap of a pine cone, the flap of a moth's wings near the fire, even the steady gurgling of the creek. I didn't sleep much. Every time I started drifting off, the forest would go quiet for 1 or 2 seconds, and I'd snap awake, convinced it was happening again. It never did, not exactly. But around 3 in the morning, I heard something move down by the creek. Not an animal sound, just a single splash, like something lightly touching the water without stepping into it. When the sky finally started turning gray, I broke camp fast. I shoved everything into my pack, barely rolling up the tent. The trail back to my truck felt longer than the hike in. I kept glancing over my shoulder even though I knew that whatever I'd seen or thought I'd seen wouldn't be walking behind me like an animal. When I got home that evening, my clothes still smelled like smoke and pine, but the cold knot in my stomach stuck around for days. The forest had gone completely silent again in my memory, perfect and absolute, and my ears kept replaying that stillness. I tried telling my uncle about it the next week when he called to check in. I didn't mention the shimmer at first. I just said the woods had gone quiet. He got serious and said he'd had that happen once, years ago, near a different section of the Bitterroots. He said he didn't stick around long enough to see anything else. I didn't tell him the rest. Even now, when I think about the way that distortion shifted to match my view, I feel the same pressure in my ears that I felt that night, like the air around me remembers. I was sitting on the back deck after dinner, letting the dog wander around the yard while the last bit of daylight faded. It had been one of those warm but not hot evenings in late July, the kind where the air feels heavy but comfortable. A thin layer of clouds stretched across the sky, moving slow enough that you could almost forget they were moving at all. I wasn't doing anything special, just scrolling my phone, half reading messages, half listening to the dog sniff every corner of the fence. The cicadas were loud, but steady. It felt like any other summer night. Then my ears popped. Not a soft little pop like you get in an elevator, a real pressure shift. Sharp, sudden. Enough that I flinched and sat up straighter. It felt like the air around me compressed for half a second, like someone had opened or closed a giant, invisible door nearby. The cicadas cut out at the exact same moment. I looked up immediately. The sky didn't look any different at first. Just those thin clouds gliding across, catching the last bits of twilight. But the silence hit harder than the pressure change. My yard isn't far from the interstate, and there's usually a faint rumble of distant traffic. There was nothing now. No insects. No cars. No wind. My dog, Milo, had stopped moving. He wasn't looking at anything in particular, just standing in the grass with his tail lowered, ears forward. I followed his gaze upward. At first, I didn't see anything. Then, through a thinner patch of cloud, I caught a single point of light drifting. Not shooting, not blinking, not streaking across the sky like a plane. Drifting. Slowly, smoothly. It wasn't bright. If anything, it looked too dim, like the glow from a phone screen viewed from far away, but it was definitely there, a pale spot moving between the layers of cloud. I stood without thinking, like stepping to the edge of the deck to get a clearer angle. My ears still felt plugged, like after swimming. I swallowed a few times, but it didn't fix it. The light kept drifting. It didn't match any aircraft pattern I'd ever seen. No blinking, no red or green markers, no contrail. It didn't even seem to be piercing the cloud. It was inside it or behind it, but close enough that the clouds glowed faintly around it. Then it slowed, just a little. Enough that I could tell because the cloud layer behind it kept moving while the light almost paused. Milo growled softly. Not barking, just that low, confused sound dogs make when something is outside their understanding. I took another step into the yard. The air felt wrong. Not colder or warmer, just thick, like breathing through fabric. I kept looking up. The light hung there motionless now, perfectly still in a patch of thinning cloud. The cloud drifted away, leaving the light exposed for maybe 2 seconds. It wasn't a light anymore. It was a small, round shape, dark, almost silhouette-like, with a thin rim of pale illumination around it. Not glowing exactly, but highlighted by something. Size was hard to judge, but it looked bigger than a drone, smaller than a plane, somewhere between. Then the cloud covered it again, and when it emerged on the other side, it was just a dim point of light once more. The pressure in my ears shifted again, this time softer, like a slow exhale from the sky. Milo whined and backed up until he was pressed against my leg. I put a hand on his back without taking my eyes off the drifting point. It began moving again, but now in a perfectly straight line toward the thicker cloud bank near the horizon. No bobbing, no rise or fall, just a steady, almost mechanical glide. Before it reached the clouds, it dimmed. Not like a light turning off. More like it was being absorbed into the darkness. Each second it grew fainter, until the only sign left was the way the clouds briefly brightened around where it should have been. Then it was gone. Just gone. The silence held for several more seconds. The air still felt heavy, my ears still felt clogged. Milo didn't move. Then, as abruptly as the pressure had come, everything snapped back. The cicadas roared to life again. A car passed on the main road, its sound rolling through the trees like normal. A breeze slipped across the yard and sent a few dried leaves skittering across the deck. My ears popped once more, finally clearing. Milo shook himself and trotted toward the house like nothing had happened. I stood in the grass for another minute or two, staring at the sky. The clouds looked ordinary now. Just gray, dull shapes drifting lazily overhead. Nothing moved behind them. Nothing glowed. I checked my phone out of instinct. The time had jumped. I had gone outside a little after 8:20. The last text I'd read was time-stamped 8:23. When I looked again, the screen said 8:37. I didn't think I'd been watching the sky for 14 minutes. Not even close. It felt like a minute or two at most. I walked around the yard to see if maybe something else had changed, but everything looked normal. The fence, the flower beds, the patio table. No scorch marks or broken branches or anything dramatic like that. Before going inside, I looked up again. The clouds were evenly lit by the fading day. The sky looked calm, peaceful. But as I turned to open the sliding door, the dog growled once more, one quick, uneasy rumble. I followed his gaze. He wasn't looking at the sky this time. He was looking just above the roofline of the house, a place I hadn't checked at all. I squinted, trying to see what he saw, but there was nothing, just a pale stretch of cloud behind the chimney. The air felt thick again for only a moment. Then, normal. I went inside and locked the door out of habit, even though nothing had really happened. Or maybe because something had. I kept glancing out the window for the rest of the night, waiting for another dim point of light to drift into view. None did. But every so often, for no clear reason, my ears would pop again. Just lightly, like something above the clouds was shifting. I was taking a late walk around my neighborhood, something I'd been doing more often since I started working from home. It was close to midnight, cool enough that I could see my breath, but not cold enough to be uncomfortable. The houses on my street are spaced out, single-story ranch-style places with big front yards and barely any streetlights. It always felt safe, quiet, predictable. That night felt normal at first. I remember hearing a dog bark a few streets over, and someone's wind chime clinking softly. The air smelled like pine and chimney smoke. I walked with my hands in my hoodie pockets, following the sidewalk past the Miller place, then the old brick house that's been empty for years. When I rounded the corner onto Ledgewood Drive, the neighborhood opened up a little. Fewer trees, wider yards, clearer view of the sky. I don't know why I looked up then, probably the way the moonlight hit something, but I did. That's when I saw it. A pale orb hovered above a rooftop about 2 blocks away. Not high in the sky, just maybe 20 or 30 feet above the shingles. It wasn't bright, it wasn't glowing like a lamp or a drone. It looked more like a soft, diffused sphere of light, the way fog sometimes glows around a street lamp, except there was nothing to illuminate it. It just hung there, perfectly still. I stopped walking without thinking. My brain tried to categorize it. A drone, maybe? A reflection? A security light? But it wasn't throwing any light onto the roof below. It wasn't flickering. It didn't strobe like aircraft lights. It looked self-contained. I stepped closer, moving slowly down the sidewalk, trying not to blink. The orb didn't react. It just existed there over the roofline of a dark house I didn't recognize. I didn't see any movement inside, no porch lights, nothing. As I got closer, the silence hit me. The dog barking earlier had stopped, the wind chimes too. Even the sound of distant cars was gone. It felt like someone had sucked all the noise out of the night. My footsteps on the pavement sounded too loud, too sharp. I slowed down again. The orb stayed exactly where it was. Maybe the size of a basketball, maybe a little bigger. The light didn't spread. It was confined to that sphere, pale and even like the color of a dim LED. Then it dimmed slightly, just a subtle shift, but enough for me to notice. It was like someone slowly turning down a dimmer switch, not abruptly, but with intention. I froze, half hidden behind a mailbox. The orb continued to dim, but it didn't shrink or drift. It didn't fall or rise. It just became fainter in place, like it was dissolving into the darkness. Then, for a moment, it stabilized, still visible, but barely. I held my breath. A few seconds passed, maybe 10. Then the orb dimmed again, this time faster, until it looked no brighter than a faint smudge of moonlight, and then it was gone. No movement, no streak, no sound, just gone, as if someone had erased it from the air. I waited where I was, listening. Still nothing. After a moment, the normal sounds returned. A car engine in the distance, a gust of wind moving through leaves, a porch light buzzing. It all came back at once, like the neighborhood had been paused. I stepped slowly toward the house where the orb had been. The air felt colder near it. Not freezing, just enough to notice. The house itself looked completely ordinary. 2 windows, shut curtains, no lights on. I didn't recognize the car in the driveway, but I don't pay attention to neighbors' cars much. I stood at the edge of the sidewalk, staring at the spot where the orb had hovered. There was nothing there now, just a blank patch of night sky. For some reason, I checked my watch. 12:08 a.m. I glanced at my phone. 11:57 p.m. I frowned. My watch isn't digital. It doesn't resync itself. I'd wound it earlier that day, and it had been accurate. Somehow it had jumped ahead 11 minutes. I walked home faster than I meant to. Every tree shadow felt off, like they were slightly out of place. I kept glancing up at rooftops, half expecting to see another pale orb resting above them. Nothing else appeared. When I got back into my house, the air inside felt warmer, normal. The heater kicked on. The refrigerator hummed. The dull buzz of the street lamp outside drifted through the window. But when I checked my watch again, it still read 12:08, even though my phone now said 11:59. The next morning, my watch had corrected itself. Or maybe corrected isn't the right word. It drifted back to the right time, minute by minute, until it matched my phone exactly. Like whatever had happened wasn't permanent. I walked past that house again later that day. It looked even more ordinary in daylight. Fresh paint, trimmed hedges, nothing weird about it at all. But I kept glancing at the roof. I didn't see anything. Still, when night came again, I closed the blinds a little tighter than usual. And before I went to bed, I checked all the clocks in the house, twice, just to make sure none of them had jumped ahead on their own. They hadn't. But around midnight, for a few seconds, the neighborhood went quiet again. Quiet in that same unnatural way, like the world was waiting for something to appear just above the roofs. The whole thing started because I couldn't sleep and ended up checking my phone at 2 in the morning. I saw a notification from my security app, motion detected in the driveway at 1:17 a.m. That wasn't unusual on its own. Raccoons, neighborhood cats, sometimes the wind pushing the trash bins. But the clip preview looked strange. Just a washed out image, like the camera had stared directly into a flashlight. I got out of bed and walked into the living room where I had a bigger screen to view the footage. The house felt colder than it usually did at night. Not freezing, just the kind of cold that made the air feel thin. My street in suburban Oregon is usually quiet, especially on weeknights, but the silence that night felt heavier than usual. I remember standing still for a moment near the window, listening for anything, not even a car in the distance. I opened the security app again and played the clip. At first, there was nothing, just the usual grainy night vision view of my driveway, my car, the walkway, the hedges. The timestamp read 1/2/17:03. The infrared looked normal, everything in that pale gray. Then the image blew out completely, washed in a white flash so bright it looked like the camera lens had exploded. No sound, just the visual whiteout. When the footage returned to normal, the timestamp jumped to 1/7/17:11, 8 seconds missing. I replayed it 3 times, and every time the jump was identical. 1:17 to 1:7:11. No gap, no glitchy transition, just seamless. You blink, and the world skips. I tilted the screen toward the window and looked out at the driveway, half expecting something to be out there, but everything looked plain. The car was where it should be. The hedges barely moved in the breeze. My neighbor's porch light glowed faintly across the street, steady. I stepped closer to the window anyway. The air felt colder near the glass. I cracked it open just an inch. The outside quiet didn't feel natural. It was like all the ambient noise had been dialed down. No passing cars, no wind through the big cedar tree in my yard, not even the hum of the power lines. I closed the window and replayed the clip again, this time slowing it down frame by frame. Right before the flash hit, the hedges on the left side of the screen shifted, but not like wind, more like something moved past them without bending a single branch. A faint distortion, almost like heat shimmer, but sharper. I checked outside again and saw nothing. No footprints in the frost on the walkway. Nothing disturbed. I saved the video to my phone and walked back toward the kitchen for a glass of water. Halfway there, the house lights flickered. Not like a full outage, just a short dip. The clock on the microwave reset when it happened, blinking 12. That scared me more than the flicker itself. My house hasn't had electrical issues since I moved in. When I went back to the living room, I opened the curtains all the way. If something had happened outside, I wanted to see it clearly. But the street looked untouched. Every house dark, every driveway empty, no movement anywhere. Just silence. I sat on the couch and rewound the footage to about 10 seconds before the flash. I noticed something else, just a tiny thing. The light in the top right corner, where the night sky was visible between the roof lines of my house and the neighbors, flickered. It wasn't lightning. There hadn't been storms. And it wasn't a passing plane. It was a single pulse of light, faint and bluish, like someone had turned on a bulb far behind the clouds. Then the flash hit and the timestamp jumped. I locked my front door again, even though it was already locked. I checked the back door too. I felt stupid doing it, but something in me didn't trust anything in the house to be the way I left it. I replayed the clip yet again, but this time I muted it and just watched. During the whiteout, the camera didn't freeze or stutter. It was actively recording, just blind. When it regained the image, nothing in the driveway looked different. No shadows out of place, no debris, no mist. The only thing that had changed was the time. It was almost 3 when I finally turned the TV on for background noise. The quiet had started to get to me. Even the refrigerator sounded too loud in the silence. I told myself I'd deal with it in the morning, call the security company, check the wiring, something rational. But when I finally tried to sleep, I couldn't stop thinking about those 8 seconds. 8 seconds where something had happened right outside my house, close enough to light up the whole front yard, but not bright enough for me to see through the curtains, even though the camera was overwhelmed by it. The next morning, I went outside before work to check the driveway for anything. Scorch marks, footprints, anything. There was nothing unusual. The frost on the car windows was undisturbed, and the hedges looked normal. The ground was frozen enough that no footprints would show unless someone really stomped around, but I still checked. I even wiped my finger across the camera lens to see if maybe something had splashed on it, caused the distortion. It looked clean. The casing felt colder than the rest of the metal trim on the house, like something had chilled the surface. Before leaving, I reviewed the footage again on my phone. I noticed one more detail I hadn't caught earlier. Right after the flash and right before the timestamp jump, the camera registered a tiny flicker of motion in the far corner of the driveway, a single frame, a shape that didn't resemble an animal or a person, too round, too symmetrical. It was gone so fast I almost convinced myself it was compression noise. Almost. Work didn't distract me as much as I hoped. I kept refreshing the camera feed remotely all day. Every time a car passed or a bird landed in the driveway, my heart jumped a little. Nothing else happened though. No flashes, no glitches. That night before bed, I stepped onto the porch and looked up at the patch of sky I'd seen flicker in the video. The air was cold but normal. No strange stillness this time. No pressure in my ears. I waited about 5 minutes, staring up at the clouds. Nothing. But when I went back inside and glanced at the security feed one last time, the timestamp did something subtle, barely noticeable unless you were watching closely. It paused for a fraction of a second, like a hiccup, not enough to count as a skip, just a stutter. Then it continued as if nothing was wrong. I sat down on the couch again, suddenly wide awake. I replayed the last 10 seconds of footage to see if I had imagined the stutter. The recording played smoothly, no pause, but the live timestamp had definitely hesitated, even if it didn't show up in the saved footage. I watched the feed longer than I meant to, waiting for another glitch, another flash. The driveway stayed still, the hedges didn't move, the night looked ordinary. But those 8 missing seconds stayed in the back of my mind, sitting there like a question that wasn't meant to be answered. And even now, sometimes when I check the live feed late at night, the timestamp hesitates for just a beat, like something out there is passing by again, just briefly enough that the camera notices even if I don't. I was camping alone near Alder Creek, a spot I'd visited a dozen times without anything strange ever happening. It wasn't a real campground, just a flat patch of dirt near the tree line where a lot of locals set up when they want quiet. I'd gotten there late in the afternoon, set up my small tent, made a fire, and cooked a simple dinner. Nothing unusual. The weather was clear, cool, and the woods felt calm in that way they do right before fall hits. By the time it got dark, I was settled in my camp chair listening to the forest. Crickets, katydids, a few owls calling from deeper in. The kind of nighttime noise that blends together into a steady backdrop. I wasn't expecting anything except maybe a raccoon sniffing around my cooler. I was just starting to think about turning in when the woods went silent. And I don't mean it got a little quieter. I mean every sound stopped at the exact same moment. The crickets, the frogs by the creek, the wind brushing through the leaves. It all cut out instantly, like someone had shut off a recording. I sat up straighter without even thinking. The silence felt too thick, like the air itself had changed. I remember holding my breath for a second because I didn't want to make noise either. My first thought was a predator, maybe a mountain lion nearby. But I didn't hear footsteps or rustling or anything that suggested movement. I listened harder. Silence. Total, complete silence. Then a soft red glow appeared behind the trees. It wasn't bright or sharp. It looked like someone was holding a dim lantern 20 or 30 yards behind the trunks, but I knew there was no path back there. The light had no defined edges, just a slow, pulsing halo that painted the silhouettes of the trees with a faint red tint. I didn't move at first. I just stared, trying to process it. The glow didn't flicker the way firelight would, and it didn't shift like someone walking with a flashlight. It stayed in one place, very still, but it felt too round, too uniform, to be any light source I recognized. It brightened slightly, not enough to illuminate the ground, but enough that the tree trunks nearest to it were outlined more clearly. The forest looked flat and strange in that light, like everything had lost its depth. My heartbeat picked up. I kept telling myself it had to be a person, some hunter walking around with gear I'd never heard of. But the glow wasn't moving like a person would. And no one camps in that area without making some noise. I would have heard footsteps or branches snapping. I reached slowly for my headlamp, trying not to make any sound. The zipper on my jacket pocket felt impossibly loud, even though I only moved it a millimeter at a time. The red glow held steady. Then, very slowly, almost too slowly to notice, it began to fade. Not in pulses, not in flickers. It just softened, like someone was lowering a dimmer switch in increments. The trees behind it, which had been silhouettes, gradually blended back into darkness. The glow shrank inward, tightening into a smaller circle. I stood up carefully, not sure why. My legs felt tense, like they were ready to run, even though I didn't know which direction was safe. As the red glow kept fading, the silence held. No insects, no creak sounds, no wind. It felt like the entire forest was waiting for something. The glow dimmed further. Now it looked like a single red ember floating behind the trees. Then it shrank again, no brighter than the light on a dying cell phone screen. Then it went out. Not abruptly, just a soft extinguishing, as if someone had gently blown on it. And the moment it disappeared, the insects returned. Not gradually. All at once. Crickets erupted, frogs croaked, leaves rustled with a light breeze that hadn't existed a second before. The shift was so sudden, I almost stumbled backward. It was like the forest had taken one long breath and finally exhaled. I turned on my headlamp and pointed it toward the trees. The light beam caught branches and low brush, but nothing else. No animals, no people, no reflective surfaces. Just ordinary forest. I waited a few minutes, telling myself the silence and the glow had to be unrelated. Maybe the insects reacted to some temperature change. Maybe the glow was a trick of my eyes. But the longer I stood there, the less I believed any of that. Eventually, I sat back down by the fire, though I didn't feel relaxed anymore. I kept glancing over my shoulder toward the place where the red glow had been. The trees looked completely normal. Everything sounded normal. If someone had walked through camp right then, they would have thought I was being paranoid for no reason. Around midnight, I forced myself into the tent. I zipped it tight and lay there listening, waiting for the silence to return or the glow to creep back into view. Neither happened. Morning came normally. Birds made noise at sunrise, the creek was flowing, and nothing looked disturbed when I stepped outside. But the air still had that faint, metallic smell I sometimes get after lightning storms, except there hadn't been any storms. I walked behind the trees to the exact spot where the glow had appeared. Nothing was there. No footprints, no fire pit, no gear, no disturbed brush. The ground was undisturbed dirt and pine needles. I stood there longer than I meant to, just staring at the empty space. The forest around me hummed with normal daytime noise, but it felt wrong in a way I couldn't explain. Like the silence from the night before was still there beneath everything, waiting for another moment to rise. I packed my campsite quickly after that. I've been back to Alder Creek since, but I don't camp in that exact spot anymore. I'm not sure what I saw, and I'm not sure the forest there is ever truly quiet for natural reasons. And every time I hear the insects fall silent, even for a second, I feel that same tightening in my chest, waiting for a soft red glow to appear behind the trees again. I woke up to my car alarm blaring at 3:14 a.m. It startled me out of a dead sleep, sharp enough that for a second I couldn't tell if the sound was part of a dream. Then the second round of honking hit, and my heart jumped. I keep my car parked in the driveway right outside my bedroom window, so when the alarm goes off, it sounds like it's practically inside the house. I rolled out of bed, grabbed my phone, and stumbled toward the window, half expecting to see someone messing with the door or a raccoon trying to climb inside. But the driveway was empty. No movement, no shadows, just my car flashing its headlights and blasting the alarm into the quiet street. I cursed under my breath, threw on a jacket, and headed for the front door. The night air rushed in the moment I stepped outside, cool, damp, and unusually still. No wind at all, not even the slightest rustle in the trees that line the edge of my yard. I walked down the steps, hitting the fob repeatedly to shut the alarm off. The honking finally stopped, leaving a ringing silence behind it. For a moment, I just stood there barefoot on the driveway, trying to understand what had triggered it. The car is old, sure, but the alarm has never gone off on its own. It's always been tied to something, someone tugging a handle, a neighbor's kid bumping it with a basketball, that kind of thing. I walked around the car slowly, using my phone's flashlight to check the doors and windows. Nothing looked disturbed. No fresh scratches, no footprints nearby, no sign anyone had approached it. Then I noticed the glow. Up near the end of the driveway, just above the fence line, a faint white light drifted upward. It wasn't bright, more like the glow of a distant lantern, soft and hazy, barely more than a suggestion of brightness. But it was definitely moving, rising into the air with a slowness that made my stomach tighten. I froze. The glow didn't flicker. It didn't change shape. It just kept rising, steady and smooth, as if following an invisible path. At first, I thought it might be a drone, but there was no sound, no hum, no buzzing. The air remained absolutely silent. I took a small step backward without meaning to. Gravel shifted under my foot, and for some reason, that tiny noise felt too loud. The glow continued upward, passing the height of the telephone pole at the edge of the street. As it climbed, the light thinned slightly, like it was dispersing, but the glow didn't fade. It just stretched. My phone pulsed in my hand. One buzz, no notification showing. The screen brightness dipped for a second before returning to normal. I pointed the flashlight toward the glow, even though I knew it wouldn't reach that high. Still, for one brief moment, as the beam angled upward, the glow hesitated. Just for a second. Then it kept rising. By the time it reached the low cloud layer, it had become more elongated, like a smudge of milk against the sky. The clouds brightened faintly where it touched, a soft, widening halo that lasted maybe 2 seconds before the glow disappeared completely into the overcast. The exact moment it vanished, every insect in the neighborhood went silent. No crickets, no night birds, no distant traffic hum, just a smooth, unnatural quiet stretching over the street. I swallowed hard and checked my car again, as if looking at something familiar would bring the world back to normal. The headlights had stopped flashing. The interior lights were off. Everything about the car looked perfectly fine. Too fine. Like whatever had happened wasn't related to the car at all, except that the alarm had noticed something before I did. I walked back toward the porch, checking over my shoulder every few steps. The clouds looked normal again. No bright spots, no shapes, just low morning fog creeping towards sunrise. Inside the house, the microwave clock was blinking. Not 12, like after a power outage, just blinking. 3:14 a.m., the exact time I'd woken up. I reset it, figured maybe the alarm surge had triggered something in the electrical system. But when I checked the living room clock, it was normal. My phone still read the correct time. Everything else was fine. Only the microwave clock had stopped at 3:14. I made coffee, even though it was too early, hoping the routine would settle the weird feeling in my stomach. But the whole time, I kept glancing at the window, half expecting the glow to come back down the same way it had gone up. It didn't. Around 6 a.m., the sun finally started to brighten the street, and I felt the tension in my body let up just enough that I could breathe normally again. I stepped outside to check for any remaining signs. The driveway looked untouched, the fence looked normal. But the air had that faint smell of ozone, sharp and metallic, almost like the aftermath of lightning. Except there hadn't been lightning. I crouched near the end of the driveway where I'd first seen the glow rise. The gravel there looked slightly disturbed, but that could have been me stepping around in the dark. I stood there for a minute, listening. Birds eventually began to chirp again, one by one. The neighborhood returned to its usual morning sounds. The world looked perfectly ordinary. But the feeling I'd had when the glow rose, that slow, deliberate movement upward, the way the air seemed to hold its breath, that stayed with me. That night, before I went to bed, I made sure the car was locked 3 times. I tested the alarm. I checked the driveway again. It was calm, dark, quiet. But when I turned off the bedroom light, a strange thought hit me out of nowhere. If the alarm hadn't gone off, I never would have seen the glow at all. I was stretched out on the hood of my car just outside Los Alamos, trying to kill time after a long day. The sky was clear enough that the Milky Way looked like someone had brushed a pale stripe across the dark. It was one of those dry, crisp nights where every sound carries, even the small ones. I could hear the faint hum of the lab's distant generators, the occasional truck on the highway, and nothing else. I wasn't looking for anything weird. I just didn't feel like going home yet. I'd been staring at the same patch of sky for maybe 5 minutes when something shifted. At first, I thought my eyes were just adjusting because the stars in that area suddenly looked out of focus. Not dimmer, just blurred, like a thumbprint smeared across a lens. I blinked a few times, thinking maybe I'd zoned out, but the distortion stayed. It was about the size of my palm, held out at arm's length, just a soft smudge where the stars lost their sharpness. The edges weren't clean. They rippled a little, like heat coming off asphalt, except I wasn't looking at the ground. I was looking straight up at a cold sky. I slid off the hood and stood, craning my neck. The smudged patch drifted a few degrees to the left. Not fast, just steady, like a slow-moving cloud. Except there were no clouds. The rest of the sky was perfect. Every star sharp, every constellation exactly where it should be. The blurred patch moved sideways for maybe 10 seconds. Then it vanished all at once. One moment it was there, rippling faintly against the stars, and the next it was gone, leaving the sky completely normal. No fade out, no transition, just gone. I stood there trying to convince myself it was some kind of weird eye strain. The desert air was dry, maybe my contacts were acting up. I rubbed my eyes and looked again. Everything looked fine. I climbed back onto the hood, but I wasn't as relaxed now. I kept scanning the sky, waiting for the blur to come back. It didn't, but something else did. About a minute after the distortion disappeared, I felt a slight vibration through the hood of the car, a faint tremor, almost like when a heavy truck drives past, but the road was too far away for that. The metal under me hummed just barely. Not loud, not strong, just enough that I noticed it. Then the radio inside the car clicked on by itself. Volume low, no station, just static. I hadn't touched the keys. I climbed off the hood again, opened the driver door, and shut the radio off manually. The moment I touched the dial, the static popped in my ears like someone unplugged a speaker. It startled me enough that I jerked my hand back. The vibration in the hood stopped at the same time. The desert around me felt suddenly too quiet. Even the faint hum from the distant buildings seemed muted. I looked back up at the sky. 3 stars near Orion flickered in a strange sequence, one, then another, then the third. Not twinkling, but blinking, like someone was dimming them deliberately. I checked to see if maybe a thin cloud had drifted through, but the rest of the stars around them stayed steady and bright. Only those 3 changed. I tried checking a star map app on my phone to reassure myself I wasn't misidentifying something, but the app wouldn't load. Not frozen, just stuck on its loading screen. My signal was fine, but the compass reading kept spinning, like the phone couldn't figure out which way was north. I lowered the phone. The same patch of sky blurred again. Not exactly in the same spot, slightly lower this time, but definitely the same distortion. The stars behind it warped, bending inward as if the space itself was shifting. I stepped backward instinctively until I bumped into the car. The blur pulsed once, almost like it tightened or contracted. Then it drifted diagonally across the sky, faster than before, maybe crossing 20 or 30 degrees of sky in a few seconds. I actually felt the air pressure change when it passed overhead, just a faint tightening in my ears like when an elevator starts moving. Then, again, it disappeared instantly. No gradual clearing, no fading, just nothing. I kept staring at the place where it had vanished, waiting for something else to happen. My breathing felt loud in my chest. I realized my hands were shaking a little, even though the night wasn't that cold. I turned in a slow circle to see if anything in the landscape looked unusual. The juniper bushes, the low rocks, the small dips in the dirt, everything looked exactly as it had when I arrived. But then I noticed something strange near my tires. The ground around my car looked patterned. Not footprints, not tire tracks. More like the surface had been pressed with something wide and flat, leaving shallow indentations almost like overlapping arcs. 3 or 4 of them, barely visible unless I angled my phone's flashlight just right. They weren't there before. I would have noticed. I crouched down to touch one of the indentations. The dirt was cold. Not normal desert night cold, but refrigerator cold. The temperature difference made me pull my hand back. I hovered my palm over the spot again, and I could feel the chill radiating outward. I stood up quickly and checked the sky one more time. Everything looked normal again. The distorted patch didn't return. The 3 flickering stars stayed steady. The pressure in the air eased back to normal, and even the faint hum of the distant facilities came back like nothing had happened. I got in my car and turned the key. The engine started right away, but the dashboard clock reset to 12 a.m., blinking like I disconnected the battery. I hadn't touched anything under the hood. When I pulled out onto the dirt road, my headlights flickered once, just once, and then stayed solid. I chalked it up to nerves, but it didn't feel like a coincidence. As I drove, I kept checking the sky in the rearview mirror. Every time I blinked, I expected to see that blur drift back into view. It never did. But the weirdest part came when I got home and checked the time. The drive from that spot to my apartment takes about 15 minutes. My dashboard clock was blinking 12, but my phone said 1:27 a.m. I'd only been out there for about an hour. I checked my call logs, my email timestamps, anything I could think of to confirm the time. They all matched the phone. Nothing was missing. I didn't feel like any time had skipped. I didn't feel dizzy or sick. The only thing off was the car. The hood was faintly warm on the left side, colder on the right, as if the temperature had been manipulated unevenly. One of the overlapping patterns in the dust showed up on the fender under the porch light, just barely visible, like it had pressed against the metal the same way it pressed into the dirt. I touched it. The metal felt normal, but I knew it hadn't been there when I left. I stayed outside for a few more minutes, watching the sky. The stars were sharp, unmoving, ordinary. I went inside, locked the door, and sat on the couch without turning any lights on. At some point, without thinking, I opened the star map app again. It loaded instantly. The compass pointed north. Every constellation matched perfectly. Except for one thing. The section of sky where I'd first seen the distortion was tagged with a strange marker, something I hadn't added. A tiny gray circle with no label, no description, no link. When I tapped it, the app froze for a moment. Then the marker disappeared. My friend Jonah was the one who noticed the light first. He called me a little after 10 p.m. on a Thursday, sounding weirdly calm for what he was saying. "Hey man," he said, "are you home right now?" "Yeah," I said. "Why?" "You might want to look outside. There's a light hovering above your neighborhood." I thought he was joking. Jonah liked messing with people, and he knew I lived in a quiet part of Greenville, the kind of area where the wildest thing you see is a loose dog or a teenager speeding in a hand-me-down Ford. But something in his voice sounded off. Not scared, just cautious. "What kind of light?" I asked. There was a pause long enough that I thought the call dropped. "It's just hanging there," he finally said. "Not moving. I can see it from my porch." Jonah lived 3 streets south of me. Whatever he was seeing had to be big, or at least bright. I walked to my front window and peeked through the blinds. All I saw were the same things as always. The oak tree across the street, Mrs. Dean's porch lamp, the faint yellow glow from the street light on the corner. Nothing unusual. "I don't see anything," I told him. "Go outside," he said. "Just step out and look up. It might be right over your block." He sounded genuinely uneasy. That alone pushed me to grab my hoodie and step out onto the porch. The night was warm enough that I didn't need the hoodie. but habit made me pull it on anyway. The street was quiet, just the hum of a distant AC unit and a cicada in one of the yards. The air smelled like someone had cut their lawn earlier. I stepped out onto the grass and looked up. The light was there. A pale white sphere, maybe the size of a basketball from where I stood, hovering directly above my house. It was too steady to be a drone, no wobbling, no blinking pattern. It wasn't overly bright either, just enough to glow softly through the thin layer of humidity. I couldn't see any structure around it. No lines, no body, nothing casting it. It just floated. "Jonah," I said into the phone, yeah. Okay, I see it now. "Is it right over you?" "Feels like it." I couldn't judge the height. It might have been 100 feet up, maybe more. The sky was too hazy to tell, but it wasn't casting much light downward. My yard wasn't lit up. My roof wasn't glowing. It seemed self-contained, like the light was meant only to be seen from below. As I watched, I got a weird sensation in my ears, like pressure shifting. Not painful, just noticeable. The cicada stopped buzzing. The AC hum down the street cut out. Every background sound dropped away at once, leaving the neighborhood unnervingly still. "Dude," Jonah said softly, "it just dimmed on my end. Did it dim for you?" I squinted. The light did look slightly fainter, like someone had turned the brightness down a notch. Then it brightened again. Not a lot, but enough that I stepped back instinctively. "What the hell?" I whispered. As soon as I said that, my porch light flickered. Once. Quick. Then the street light on the corner flickered too. "Are your lights doing that?" Jonah asked. "Yeah." I felt something then. Not vibration, but presence. Like the air around me had weight. The hairs on my arms stood up under my hoodie. I kept staring at the orb, waiting for it to move sideways or upward or anything. It didn't. It hung there perfectly still, as if observing or adjusting. I realized then that none of the trees were moving. No breeze, no rustle. The leaves looked frozen in place. "I think it's right over my roof," I whispered. "It's not moving at all." "Go back inside," Jonah said immediately. "Seriously." But I didn't. I stepped farther into the yard for a clearer view. The orb flickered again. Not like a dying light, more like a pulse. A quick contraction of brightness followed by a longer glow. Then it shifted color for a split second, turning the faintest blue before returning to white. The pressure in my ears deepened. My phone connection crackled. "Hello?" Jonah said. "Man, are you still?" The call dropped. I lowered the phone and looked at it. No service. Full bars one moment, nothing the next. The orb dimmed again. This time it didn't brighten afterward. It stayed faint, shrinking slightly around the edges like the glow was collapsing inward. Then it started to descend. Just a few feet. Slowly. Not enough to be dramatic, but enough that I stumbled backward toward the porch steps. The pressure in my ears eased up for a moment, then returned stronger. My porch light flickered again, this time staying dim for a second before stabilizing. "Okay," I muttered. Heart pounding. Okay. I reached the door, hand on the knob, but I couldn't bring myself to go inside. Curiosity pinned me in place. I kept watching. The orb stopped descending. It hovered again at its new height, maybe 20 or 30 feet lower than before. It didn't move sideways. It didn't rotate. It didn't behave like anything that should exist in the air without support. Then it flickered sharply, like a camera shutter. Once, twice. Each flicker came with a tiny delay, like it was syncing with something I couldn't hear. My phone screen lit up even though I wasn't touching it. It displayed the time, 10:48 p.m. Then the numbers glitched, shifting to 3:12 p.m., then 12 a.m., then back to 10:48. The screen froze, then went black. I didn't have time to react. The orb suddenly dimmed faster, shrinking to a pinpoint of light the size of a star. Then it faded completely. Not shot upward, not drifted away, just faded, like someone erased it from the sky. Sound returned instantly, the cicada buzzing, the AC hum, a car in the distance, like someone had turned the neighborhood back on. The pressure in my ears vanished. The breeze returned, rustling the leaves softly. My porch lights steadied. Everything snapped back into place. Jonah called again. "You still outside?" he asked, breathless. "Yeah, it's gone." "Gone how?" "It just faded." He didn't say anything for a few seconds. Then, it looked like it blinked out from here. One second it was there, the next it just wasn't. I walked back into the yard, standing roughly where I'd been when the orb hovered above me. The sky looked normal now, just haze and the faint orange glow of the city. But something was off. The grass beneath my feet was flattened in a circular pattern, maybe 8 or 9 feet wide. Not crushed, just gently pressed, like something had hovered low enough for the air pressure to push it down. In the center, the blades were bent inward. "I've got something in my yard," I told him. "A pattern. Looks fresh." "You think it landed?" I didn't see anything land. I crouched down and touched the grass. It was cold, colder than the rest of the yard. Not wet, not frost, just unnaturally chilled. "I'm coming over," Jonah said. "No," I said immediately. "Stay home, there's nothing to see now." But he came anyway. By the time he pulled up, the circle in the yard was already rising back up, the grass slowly straightening like nothing had touched it. He saw the tail end of it, but not the shape it had been. We stood in the yard for a long minute, both of us staring at the empty sky. "Do you hear that?" Jonah asked quietly. "Hear what?" He shook his head. "Nothing. That's the weird part." Because the cicada had stopped again, and the wind was still. The neighborhood went quiet a second time, but only for a moment. Then sound returned again, just as quickly. We didn't talk after that. Jonah went home. I went inside and locked the door without really thinking about it. Later that night, when I checked my phone again, the time was normal and the service was back. But one thing stood out that hadn't been there before. In my call history, right between Jonah's 2 calls was a missed call from an unknown number. Timestamp 10:47 p.m., 1 minute before the light faded. The number had no digits, just a blank space. I only saw the notification the next morning. My security camera app sent me an alert around 2:14 a.m., but I'd been asleep and didn't check it until I was standing in my kitchen making coffee. I remember rubbing my eyes, half awake, and tapping the thumbnail expecting to see a raccoon or maybe a stray cat. My backyard isn't fenced well, and animals wander through all the time. But instead of the usual clip, there was just a 2-second video of pure white. Not bright like a flashlight, not blown out like a glitch. It was a single solid wash of white that filled the entire frame. Yard, porch, trees, everything gone. I checked the timeline bar under the clip, expecting it to be corrupted, but something else was wrong. The time jumped. The clip started at 2:14:06 a.m., it ended at 2:14:06 a.m., and the next video started at 2:13 a.m. 7 seconds missing. At first I figured maybe the camera hiccuped. It's a cheap model, and the Wi-Fi in my house cuts out sometimes. But when I stepped to the back door and looked outside, something felt off. The grass looked damp even though it hadn't rained. The air felt still and warm, like the oven had been on. And the birds, which normally scream their heads off at dawn, were quiet. I told myself I was overthinking it. I forced myself to drink coffee, feed the dog, and get ready for work. But I kept checking the camera feed on my phone, scrubbing back and forth between 2:14:06 and 2:14:13, like I had missed something. Nothing. Just the same blank flash and a dead gap. That night, around 10, I decided to sit up and watch the yard live. I wasn't expecting anything. Mostly, I wanted to prove to myself that nothing weird was happening. I turned on the porch light and left the curtains open just a couple inches so I could see the window from the couch. By midnight, I was bored. I muted the TV and listened for anything outside, but the only sound was the refrigerator humming. I checked the yard again. Nothing. Just still grass and the faint pool of porch light. Around 1:40, I nodded off. I don't remember falling asleep. I just remember jerking awake suddenly, like someone whispered something too close to my ear. The house was dark, except for the porch light seeping in through the window crack. My phone screen was lit up on the coffee table. Another motion alert. My heart started pounding because I hadn't heard anything. No footsteps on the deck, no rustling. I reached for the phone with that weird, shaky hesitation you get when you're not sure you want to see what's on the screen. The thumbnail was white again. I tapped it. Same thing as the night before, a burst of white filling the whole frame. But this time it lasted longer, 3 seconds instead of 2, and the timestamp jumped again, this time by 9 seconds. I checked the live feed. The yard looked normal, totally normal. Porch light on, fence in the back catching the glow, nothing moving. But the air in the house felt different, heavy like before a storm, except the forecast was clear. Even the dog, who normally sleeps through everything, was standing in the hallway staring toward the back door with her ears pinned flat. I turned off the TV and walked to the window. The moment I touched the curtain, the outside world felt wrong. Not visually. Everything looked the same, but the atmosphere felt stale, like the air hadn't moved in hours. I unlocked the back door and stepped onto the porch. The warmth hit first. The night had been cool earlier, but now it felt like walking into a room that had been shut for too long. The yard smelled faintly metallic, like hot wires or distant fireworks. I crouched to touch the grass near the steps. Warm. Not damp this time. Warm. No obvious reason for it. I stood there for a while, listening. The sound, or lack of sound, was the same as the morning. No insects, no wind, no distant cars, just dead quiet. Even the dog refused to follow me outside. She stood at the threshold, whining softly. I backed into the house and shut the door, but didn't lock it. I needed my hands free. I pulled up the camera feed again on my phone. The live view glitched. Just a flicker, like static, but enough to show a frame where the backyard looked darker than it should. The porch light was on, but for one split second, the yard was dim, like something passed in front of the camera. Then it returned to normal. I stayed awake until almost 3, checking the feed every few minutes. Nothing else happened. But the next morning, when I stepped outside, I noticed a thin strip of grass near the far end of the yard was flattened. Not trampled, just pressed down in a long, straight line, maybe 20 feet long. No footprints. No wheel marks. Just a smooth depression like something heavy had hovered low enough to push the grass down without touching it. I took pictures, though I didn't know who I'd show them to. Before leaving for work, I checked the camera footage again. No new alerts. But I noticed something I hadn't seen earlier. Between the white flash and the next video, a single frame existed at the end of the corrupted clip. A gray shape, just for a fraction of a second. Not a figure, not an animal. More like the bottom curve of something smooth and bright, like metal catching light. The frame was too blurry to identify anything, but it wasn't there the night before. Or maybe I hadn't noticed it. That was 2 weeks ago. Nothing else has happened since, not visibly. But the security camera skips sometimes, random jumps of 1 or 2 seconds, and every time it does, I check the yard. And every morning before I leave for work, I walk across the grass to see if a new strip has been pressed down. So far, none have. But sometimes at around 2 in the morning, the dog lifts her head, ears twitching, like she hears something outside before I do. And every time she does that, I look at the clock and wait to see if the camera will send another alert. Another burst of impossible white washing out the whole world for a few seconds I'll never get back. I was driving back from my sister's place in Clover Ridge, taking the long rural stretch of County 14, because it saves about 20 minutes if you don't get stuck behind a tractor. It was close to 10 p.m., early spring, the kind of night where the air is cool but not cold, and everything smells like damp dirt and leftover snowmelt. That road doesn't have streetlights, barely has reflectors, and the closest town is a good 15 miles away. I'd driven it so many times I didn't think twice about taking it in the dark. Had the radio on low, some oldie station playing a song I recognized from the drive up. The fields on either side were just wide, flat expanses disappearing into darkness. I remember thinking how empty everything felt, even more than usual, like the night had swallowed all the usual farm noises. The first strange thing was the sky. About 2 miles past the abandoned grain silo, the sky ahead of me changed color. Not bright, not dramatic, just faintly silver, like someone held up a giant sheet of aluminum really far away. It wasn't lightning, it wasn't moonlight. The sky wasn't glowing, it was reflecting something. That's what made it so unsettling. You don't expect the sky to reflect anything. I slowed down without realizing it. My headlights stretched across the gravel shoulder, but everything in front of me had this pale sheen, like driving toward a mirage. The silver wasn't uniform either. It had a texture, almost like brushed metal, shimmering slightly as if something moved behind it. I actually lifted my foot off the gas completely and rolled to a crawl. The hair on my arms stood straight up, and I didn't know why yet. I just knew something was wrong. The radio crackled. Not static, just a brief distortion, like the sound bent. The song kept playing, but the vocals wavered and dipped in pitch before smoothing out again. I looked down at the display, half expecting the station number to flicker, but it stayed the same. When I looked back up, the silver sky was changing. It wasn't silver anymore. It was thinning, fading upward like fog drawn into a vent, not rising like smoke, contracting, pulling itself into a narrower and narrower band until it became nothing but a faint line. Then that line folded into a bright pinprick and winked out. The sky went back to black, perfectly normal. I sat there for a second, foot hovering over the gas pedal, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. Nothing moved. No cars were coming. The fields around me were silent, too silent. I finally exhaled without realizing I'd been holding my breath. I hit the gas gently and started rolling forward again. The road looked the same as always. Long, empty, flat. Whatever I'd seen didn't leave any sign behind. Then the song on the radio started over. Not replayed on purpose. Not like the station looped it. It restarted from the very beginning. Same song, same opening notes, as if someone had hit rewind and play instantly. I knew for sure it was the same track because I'd been humming the chorus under my breath before everything went weird. I stared at the radio again. The time on the display hadn't changed. It didn't reset or blink. The station didn't change. But the song had definitely restarted itself. I turned the volume down. Not off, I just didn't want the music covering up whatever else I might hear. My heart was beating hard enough that I could feel it in my throat, and the steering wheel felt slick under my palms. The next half mile felt like driving underwater. The air had weight to it, heavy and thick, like the pressure had shifted. My ears popped once, then popped again, even though the elevation wasn't changing. That was the second moment I should have turned around, but I didn't. I kept going, telling myself it was nothing, just some atmospheric thing or a radio glitch. That's all it could be. Then I saw movement in the field to my right. Not a person, not an animal, just movement. Darkness shifting against darkness. A long shape, low to the ground, gliding more than walking. It stayed parallel to the road, matching my speed even though I was going about 30 by then. I squinted through the window, trying to make out what it was. It wasn't big enough to be a cow. It wasn't moving like a deer. And it made no sound, no crunch of gravel, no breaking of brush, nothing. I tapped the brakes. The shape slowed. I pressed the gas. It sped up. I wasn't breathing at that point. I don't even think I blinked. I just kept watching that shape move in tandem with my car, like it was aware of me. The silver light did something. That's all I could think. Whatever I saw in the sky wasn't just light. It did something to the air, or the road, or me. Something wasn't normal anymore. I hit the brakes hard enough that the seatbelt locked. The shape stopped instantly, but not like it had momentum, not like it slowed down. It just stopped, like someone paused a video frame. 1 second it was gliding, the next it was completely motionless. The radio made a soft click, as if powering off, but the screen stayed lit. The song stopped mid-word. My car idled in the middle of the road. The only sound was the engine and my breathing, sharp, uneven. The shape in the field didn't move, didn't shift, didn't drift away. It just stayed there, still and waiting. I don't know how long I sat like that, maybe 10 seconds, maybe 30. Long enough for my hands to start shaking on the wheel. Then something changed in the sky again, not silver this time. Just a faint glow, almost invisible, drifting high above the road. The kind of thing you'd miss entirely if you weren't already terrified and looking for anything out of place. It moved in a slow arc, like tracing the curvature of the earth, then faded before reaching the horizon. As soon as it vanished, the shadow shape in the field dissolved, not ran, not fell. Dissolved, like smoke blown apart by a wind I couldn't feel. The radio cut back in with the exact same song, in the exact same place where it had restarted before. No rewind this time, just continuing like nothing had happened. I started driving, slowly at first, then fast. Too fast for that road. I didn't care. I just needed to get away from that stretch of highway. When I finally saw the lights of the next town, I pulled into the first gas station and parked under the brightest canopy I could find. My legs took a second to cooperate when I tried to stand. The cashier probably thought I was drunk or exhausted from the way I walked inside. I stayed there almost an hour. The sky looked normal. My radio behaved normally. Every song played all the way through without restarting. But when I checked the route on my phone, the estimated drive time showed something strange. I'd arrived 8 minutes later than I should have, even with the speeding. I checked my dashboard clock. It matched my phone. Nothing obvious was missing. Just 8 minutes that didn't line up with the distance traveled. I drove home with the radio off after that. I still take County 14 sometimes. It's the only road that connects some of the smaller towns. But every time I'm on that stretch near the grain silo, I feel my hands tighten on the wheel, and I always watch the sky for silver.